In the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, there is a fragment of painted limestone that shows a family. A king and a queen sit on cushioned thrones beneath the rays of the sun. The sun's rays end in tiny hands. Hands that reach down from the disk to touch the royal couple, to offer them the ankh, the symbol of life. Between the king and the queen, and on their laps, are children, small girls, their heads shaved in the sidelock of youth, their bodies rendered with the distinctive elongated style that characterizes the art of the Amarna period. The eldest of these girls, the one depicted most prominently, the one closest to her parents, the one who appears in more scenes and more inscriptions than any of her sisters, is Meritaten, the beloved of the Aten, the firstborn daughter of the pharaoh Akhenaten and the queen Nefertiti, the child who was born into a religious revolution and who would be consumed by its collapse. Meritaten was born into the most extraordinary royal household in all of Egyptian history. Her father, Akhenaten, originally named Amenhotep IV, had done something no Egyptian pharaoh had ever done before and none would ever do again. He had abolished the traditional gods. He had closed the temples. He had redirected the resources of the state toward the worship of a single deity, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, the god that Akhenaten declared was the sole creator and sustainer of all life. He had built a new capital city, Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten, in the desert of Middle Egypt at the site we now call Amarna, and he had moved the entire royal court, the entire administrative apparatus of the state, from the ancient capital of Thebes to this new city in the wilderness. He had launched a religious revolution that overturned 3,000 years of Egyptian tradition, and that would, within a generation, be condemned as the greatest heresy in Egyptian history. Meritaten grew up at the center of this revolution. She was depicted in the art of the Amarna period with a frequency and a prominence that no other royal child in Egyptian history had ever received. She appeared in family scenes, playing with her sisters, sitting on her mother's lap, receiving the blessings of the Aten. She appeared in state ceremonies, standing beside her parents as they made offerings to the sun god, participating in the rituals that were the public expression of the new religion. She appeared on the walls of temples, on the boundary stelae that marked the limits of the new capital, on the private tombs of the officials who served her father's court. She was everywhere. She was visible. She was, for a brief and extraordinary period, one of the most prominently depicted individuals in all of Egyptian art. And then she vanished. The revolution collapsed. Akhenaten died. The traditional gods were restored. The temples were reopened. The city of Amarna was abandoned. Its buildings dismantled. Its stones carried away for use in other construction projects. Its streets left to the sand and the silence. And the names of the Amarna royals, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Meritaten, and all the others who had participated in the heretical revolution, were struck from the official record. They were removed from the king lists. They were erased from the monuments. They were condemned, not merely forgotten, but actively and deliberately destroyed. Their very existence treated as a contamination that had to be purged from the memory of the Egyptian state. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand the story of the woman who was born into a revolution she did not choose, and who was destroyed by its aftermath. A woman who was one of the most visible individuals in ancient Egyptian art, and who was then made one of the most invisible. A woman whose father abolished the gods and whose generation paid the price. And a woman whose erasure was not personal but collective, the product of a condemnation that swept away an entire family, an entire court, an entire city, and an entire period of Egyptian history. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it genuinely helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The shadow has been there for 3,300 years. It has been visible to anyone who studied the Amarna period and noticed the eldest daughter, the girl who appeared in more scenes than any of her sisters, who was elevated to the position of great royal wife, who may have ruled Egypt as pharaoh, and who then vanished from the record as completely as if she had never existed. The shadow is Meritaten, and the shadow has a story of a woman born into a world she did not choose, condemned for a revolution she did not start, and erased from history by a mechanism that this series has not yet examined. the mechanism of collective condemnation, the erasure that sweeps away not individuals, but entire generations, not specific achievements, but entire eras, not particular women, but every woman associated with a condemned regime. The condemnation that consumed Meritaten was unlike any other form of erasure documented in this series. It was not targeted at her as an individual. It was not motivated by hostility toward her personal achievements or her personal qualities. It was directed at the entire world she inhabited. The city, the religion, the artistic tradition, the royal family, the court, and every individual who had been part of the Amarna experiment. The condemnation was collective, it was comprehensive, and it was designed to be permanent, to erase not just the people but the period, not just the individuals but the era, not just the names but the very memory that the names had ever existed. Now, let's begin. To understand Meritaten, you must first understand the Amarna Revolution, the religious upheaval that transformed the Egyptian state during the reign of her father, and that created the world into which she was born. The revolution was, by any measure, the most radical and the most disruptive event in the entire 3,000-year history of pharaonic civilization. No other pharaoh had attempted anything comparable. No other reign had produced such a thorough and such a deliberate transformation of the religious, artistic, and political institutions of the Egyptian state, and no other period in Egyptian history had been so comprehensively condemned by the generations that followed. The revolution began gradually. Amenhotep IV, as Akhenaten was originally known, ascended to the throne around 1353 BC, according to current chronological estimates, as the son of Amenhotep III, one of the wealthiest and most powerful pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. The early years of his reign showed signs of an intensifying devotion to the sun god. The construction of temples dedicated to the Aten at Karnak, the adoption of new artistic styles that depicted the royal family in the distinctive elongated forms that would characterize Amarna art, and the beginning of a theological program that elevated the Aten above the other gods of the Egyptian pantheon. But the early years did not yet suggest the radical break that was to come. The break came in approximately the 5th year of the reign. Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, a public declaration that his identity and his authority were derived not from the traditional gods of Egypt, but from the Aten alone. He began the construction of a new capital city in Middle Egypt, Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, on a site that had never been occupied before, and that was chosen, according to the king's own inscriptions, by the Aten himself. He moved the royal court from Thebes to the new capital. He closed the temples of Amun and the other traditional gods, or at least withdrew the state support that sustained them. He redirected the resources of the state, the labor, the materials, the economic surplus that had previously funded the traditional temple system, toward the construction and the maintenance of the new capital and the new religion. He sent agents throughout Egypt to chisel the name of Amun from the monuments, a systematic campaign of iconoclasm that targeted the most powerful god in the Egyptian pantheon, and that was designed to erase the very memory of the deity that the Aten was replacing. The scale of the revolution was extraordinary. It affected every dimension of Egyptian life: religious, political, artistic, economic, and social. The temples that had been the centers of local religious life for centuries were closed or defunded. The priests who had maintained the traditional cults were dismissed or marginalized. The artists who had worked in the traditional Egyptian style were required to adopt the new Amarna style, a style that was radically different from anything that had preceded it, characterized by elongated figures, exaggerated features, and an emphasis on the intimacy of the royal family that was unprecedented in Egyptian art. The bureaucrats who administered the state were relocated from Thebes to the new capital. The military commanders who defended the empire were required to operate from a capital that was strategically remote from the empire's borders. The entire apparatus of the Egyptian state was uprooted and replanted in a city that had not existed 5 years earlier, and that was built from the ground up to serve the needs of the new religion. The religious context of the revolution deserves careful attention because it provides the framework within which Meritaten's entire life was lived. the traditional Egyptian religion, the system that Akhenaten overthrew, was a complex, polytheistic system that had developed over more than 2,000 years, and that permeated every aspect of Egyptian life. The gods were everywhere, in the temples that dominated the skylines of every Egyptian city, in the festivals that punctuated the agricultural calendar, in the rituals that accompanied birth, marriage, death, and every other significant transition in human life. The gods were not distant or abstract. They were immediate, present, and actively involved in the daily affairs of the human world. The Nile flooded because the gods willed it. The crops grew because the gods blessed them. The pharaoh ruled because the gods had chosen him. The entire fabric of Egyptian society, its political structure, its economic system, its social hierarchy, its artistic traditions, was woven from the threads of religious belief. Akhenaten tore this fabric apart. He did not merely add a new god to the existing pantheon, a practice that had precedence in Egyptian history, and that would have been relatively unremarkable. He abolished the existing gods entirely, declaring that the Aten was the sole deity, that the traditional gods were false, and that the entire religious system that had sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia was a lie. The radicalism of this claim cannot be overstated. It was not a reform. It was a revolution, a total rejection of the religious foundations on which the entire social, political, and economic order of the Egyptian state had been built. The impact on the population was devastating. The temples that had been the centers of local economic and religious life were closed. The priests who had maintained the cults were dismissed. The festivals that had structured the agricultural calendar were cancelled. The rituals that had accompanied the major transitions of human life, birth, coming of age, marriage, death, were disrupted or abolished. The entire support system that the traditional religion had provided to the population, not just spiritual support but economic support, in the form of the temple economies that employed thousands of people and distributed food and goods to the poor, was dismantled. The revolution was not merely a theological disagreement. It was a social catastrophe, an upheaval that affected the daily lives of millions of people and that created hardship, confusion, and resentment that would eventually fuel the backlash that destroyed the revolution and everything associated with it. Meritaten grew up in the eye of this storm. She was raised in the new religion, taught from infancy that the Aten was the only god, that her father was the Aten's sole representative on earth, and that the world she inhabited, the city of Akhenaten, the rituals of the Aten cult, the artistic conventions of the Amarna style, was the true and proper order of the universe. She had no experience of the old religion. She had no memory of the traditional gods. She had never worshipped Amun or Osiris or Isis or any of the deities that the rest of Egypt regarded as the fundamental powers of the cosmos. Her entire religious formation was conducted within the framework of the Aten theology, a theology that she had no reason to question because it was the only theology she had ever known. This fact, the fact that Meritaten was formed by the revolution rather than choosing it, is essential for understanding the injustice of her subsequent condemnation. She was not a convert to the Aten religion. She was not a person who had examined the traditional religion and rejected it in favor of something she considered superior. She was a child who had been raised in a specific religious tradition and who had internalized that tradition as naturally and as unconsciously as every other child in every other civilization has internalized the religious traditions of their parents. Her heresy was not a choice. It was an inheritance, passed down to her by her father, reinforced by her mother, confirmed by the entire social environment in which she grew up. To condemn her for this inheritance was to condemn a person for the accident of their birth, to hold an individual responsible for circumstances that she had not created and could not have changed. The artistic revolution that accompanied the religious revolution was, for Meritaten, the visual language of her entire childhood. The Amarna style, the distinctive artistic conventions that characterized the art of Akhenaten's reign, was radically different from the traditional Egyptian style that had governed artistic production for millennia. The traditional style was idealized and formal. Figures were depicted in standardized poses with idealized proportions. in compositions that followed strict conventions of hierarchy and arrangement. The Amarna style broke with these conventions in almost every respect. Figures were depicted with elongated skulls, narrow shoulders, wide hips, thin limbs, and prominent bellies, a style that has been variously interpreted as a realistic depiction of the royal family's actual physical appearance, as a theological statement about the androgynous creative power of the Aten, or as a deliberate aesthetic provocation designed to signal the break with tradition that the revolution demanded. The family scenes that are the hallmark of Amarna art. The scenes of the king and queen playing with their daughters, kissing their children, making offerings together beneath the rays of the sun, were unprecedented in Egyptian royal art. Previous pharaohs had been depicted in formal, hieratic poses, standing, sitting, smiting enemies, making offerings to the gods. They were not depicted playing with their children. They were not depicted in moments of domestic intimacy. The conventional artistic vocabulary of Egyptian kingship did not include tenderness, playfulness, or the kind of physical affection between parents and children that the Amarna scenes depict with such warmth and such frequency. The inclusion of these scenes in the official artistic program of the Amarna period was a deliberate theological statement, a declaration that the royal family's love for each other was itself a manifestation of the Aten's creative power, that the domestic life of the king and queen was not merely a private matter but a cosmic event, and that the children, particularly Meritaten, the eldest, were living evidence of the Aten's blessing. The prominence of the children in Amarna art, and particularly the prominence of Meritaten as the eldest, had no precedent in earlier Egyptian art and would have no parallel in later Egyptian art. In the traditional artistic program, royal children were rarely depicted, and when they were depicted, they were shown in formal, standardized poses that gave little indication of their individual personalities or their relationships with their parents. The Amarna scenes are different. They show children who are individuals, children who play, who squirm, who reach for their parents, who interact with each other with the kind of spontaneous energy that any parent would recognize. The scenes are, in a sense, the first family portraits in the history of art, the first deliberate attempt to depict a family not as a set of formal relationships, but as a group of human beings who love each other. Meritaten is the most prominent figure in these scenes after her parents. She is depicted closest to the king and queen. She is shown receiving special attention, being kissed, being held, being presented with gifts. Her prominence reflects her position as the eldest daughter, the first fruit of the royal marriage, the primary evidence of the Aten's creative blessing. But her prominence also reflects something more personal, a sense that the artists who depicted her were capturing not merely a theological concept, but a genuine relationship, a real affection between parents and child that transcended the formulaic conventions of royal art. The artistic legacy of the Amarna period, the scenes that survive in the tombs, on the boundary stelae, and on the reassembled Talatat blocks, is the primary evidence for Meritaten's existence during the years of the revolution. Without these scenes, we would know almost nothing about her. Her name would be a line in an inscription, a title in a list, a reference without a context. The scenes give her a context. They show her in the world she inhabited, the world of the Aten, the world of the new city, the world of the family that was both a domestic unit and a theological institution. The scenes make her real, not merely a name but a person, a child who grew up in extraordinary circumstances and who was depicted with a prominence and an intimacy that no other royal child in Egyptian history had ever received. The Aten theology that Meritaten inherited from her father was, in theological terms, one of the most radical religious innovations in the history of the ancient world. The theology was not merely monotheistic, though it is often described in those terms. It was exclusivist. It did not merely elevate the Aten above other gods, but denied the existence of other gods entirely, treating the traditional deities as illusions or as manifestations of the ignorance that the Aten's light was supposed to dispel. The great hymn to the Aten, the magnificent poem that is inscribed in the tomb of the official I at Amarna, and that is often attributed to Akhenaten himself, presents a vision of the natural world as the product of a single creative intelligence, a single divine will that sustains all life through the light and the warmth of the solar disk. The hymn celebrates the beauty of the natural world, the rising of the sun, the stirring of birds and animals, the dependence of all living things on the light that the Aten provides. The hymn is one of the great religious poems of the ancient world, and it is the theological framework within which Meritaten was raised, the text that defined her understanding of the universe and her place within it. The economic dimension of the revolution further shaped the world Meritaten inhabited. The traditional temple system was not merely a religious institution, it was an economic engine employing thousands and serving as the welfare system of the Egyptian state. When Akhenaten closed the temples and redirected their resources to the Aten cult, he was dismantling the economic infrastructure that sustained millions of people. The consequences were felt throughout Egypt. In the cities where the temple economies had been the primary source of employment, in rural areas where temple granaries had provided security against crop failure, and in the lives of the thousands of priests, administrators, and workers who had depended on the temple system for their livelihoods. The economic disruption contributed to the resentment that fueled the restoration and the ferocity of the condemnation that followed. The fragility of Meritaten's world, the world of the Amarna court, was a direct consequence of the revolution's radical break with the institutional foundations of the Egyptian state. The traditional Egyptian state derived its stability from the distribution of power among multiple institutions: the monarchy, the priesthood, the military, the provincial administration, each of which provided a check on the others, and each of which served as a source of stability during periods of transition or crisis. Akhenaten's revolution concentrated all institutional authority in the hands of the king and his family, eliminating the independent power of the priesthood, marginalizing the traditional aristocracy, and creating a system that was entirely dependent on the continued vitality and authority of the revolutionary pharaoh. The exclusivism of the Aten theology had consequences that extended far beyond the temple walls. By denying the existence of the traditional gods, Akhenaten was denying the validity of the entire moral and cosmological framework that the traditional religion had provided. The concept of Mat, the Egyptian idea of truth, justice, and cosmic order, had been maintained in the traditional system by the combined efforts of the gods, the pharaoh, and the priesthood. The Aten theology replaced this collaborative maintenance of cosmic order with a simpler but also more fragile model, a model in which the Aten alone sustained the cosmic order, with the pharaoh as his sole intermediary and the royal family as the sole channel through which the divine blessing flowed to the rest of humanity. The fragility of this model became apparent when the pharaoh died, because the death of the sole intermediary threatened the entire theological structure, leaving the cosmic order without its essential human anchor. This theological fragility is essential for understanding the crisis that followed Akhenaten's death, and for understanding the vulnerability of Meritaten's position during the transitional period. The Aten theology had placed the royal family at the center of the cosmic order, but it had also made the cosmic order dependent on the royal family. When Akhenaten died, the cosmic order was disrupted, not merely politically, as the succession was contested and the court factions maneuvered for position, but theologically, as the fundamental mechanism by which the divine blessing was supposed to reach the world ceased to function. The restoration of the traditional gods was therefore not merely a political act. It was a theological necessity, a response to a genuine crisis of cosmic order that the Aten theology had created by concentrating all mediatory power in a single human being. Meritaten was born into this world, the world of the revolution, the world of the new city, the world of the Aten. She was probably born in the early years of the reign, perhaps around the time of the move to Amarna, perhaps slightly before. Her name, Meritaten, beloved of the Aten, was itself a statement of the new theology, a declaration that the princess was loved by the god that her father had placed at the center of the universe. She was the eldest of 6 daughters born to Akhenaten and Nefertiti, 6 girls whose names all invoked the Aten and whose existence was celebrated in the art of the period with an exuberance and tenderness that are unique in the history of Egyptian royal depiction. The family scenes of the Amarna period are among the most famous and most frequently reproduced images in Egyptian art. They show Akhenaten and Nefertiti seated together, their daughters playing around them, the rays of the Aten streaming down from above, each ray ending in a tiny hand that offers the ankh to the royal family. The scenes are intimate. They show the king and queen kissing their children, holding them on their laps, playing with them in the garden of the royal palace. The intimacy is deliberate. It was part of the theological program of the Amarna period, which presented the royal family as the earthly embodiment of the Aten's creative power, the living demonstration of the god's love for his creation. The family was not merely a private domestic unit. It was a theological institution, a visual representation of the Aten's relationship to the world, with the king and queen serving as intermediaries between the god and the rest of humanity, and the children serving as evidence of the god's creative blessing. The construction of the city itself was an act of extraordinary ambition and extraordinary expenditure, requiring the mobilization of thousands of workers, the transportation of building materials from quarries across Egypt, and the creation of an entire urban infrastructure in a location where nothing had existed before. The speed of the construction was remarkable. The city appears to have been substantially completed within 5 to 10 years, a pace that required the kind of focused, intensive effort that only a state with Egypt's resources and organizational capacity could achieve. The city was designed as a demonstration, a physical proof that the Aten theology could sustain not merely a cult but an entire civilization, that the new religion could provide the foundation for a functioning urban community, complete with palaces, temples, workshops, residences, and all the other elements of a major Egyptian city. Meritaten was the most prominent of the children in these scenes. As the eldest daughter, she occupied the most important position in the hierarchy of the royal children. She was depicted closest to her parents. She was mentioned first in the inscriptions, and she received the most elaborate titles and the most frequent representations. Her prominence in the art was not merely a reflection of her birth order, it was a reflection of her theological importance. As the firstborn child of the king and queen, she was the primary evidence of the Aten's creative power, the first fruit of the divine blessing that the god had bestowed upon the royal couple. The city of Amarna, the setting in which Meritaten spent her childhood and her adolescence, was one of the most remarkable urban experiments in ancient history. Built in the desert on a site that had never been inhabited, the city stretched for roughly 12 kilometers along the east bank of the Nile, occupying a broad bay in the cliffs that lined the river. The city was divided into distinct zones. The central city, which contained the main palace complex, the great temple of the Aten, and the administrative buildings of the state. The North City, which contained the North Palace, where Meritaten may have lived during her later years. The South City, which contained the residential quarters of the court officials, and the workmen's village, which housed the labourers who built and maintained the city and its monuments. The city was built rapidly, probably in 5 to 10 years, and it was built to a standard of quality that reflected the resources and the ambition of the Aten Revolution. The palaces were decorated with painted floors and walls, with scenes of natural beauty, birds, fish, plants, animals that reflected the Amarna period's distinctive emphasis on the beauty of the natural world as a manifestation of the Aten's creative power. Nefertiti, Meritaten's mother, occupied a position of extraordinary prominence in the Amarna religious system. She was not merely the great royal wife, the highest female title in the Egyptian hierarchy. She was a participant in the Aten cult at a level that exceeded anything that had been seen in previous reigns. She appeared in the art-performing rituals that had previously been reserved for the king alone, making offerings to the Aten, driving chariots, smiting enemies. She bore elaborate titles that associated her directly and intimately with the Aten's creative power. Titles that placed her alongside the king as a co-creator, a co-worshipper, and a co-intermediary between the god and the world. Her image appeared on the boundary stelae of Amarna with the same frequency and the same prominence as the king's, a powerful visual statement that the royal couple were equal and active partners in the religious revolution they had launched. The role of Meritaten's mother Nefertiti in the Amarna religious system deserves further emphasis because it shaped the expectations and the possibilities that defined Meritaten's own career. Nefertiti was not merely the great royal wife in a conventional sense. She was a co-creator of the Aten theology, a partner in the religious revolutions whose theological authority was in some respects comparable to the king's own. Her striking images show her performing important rituals that had previously been exclusively reserved for the pharaoh, smiting enemies, making offerings without the king's presence, driving chariots in scenes of royal power that had no female precedent. The precedent that Nefertiti established, the precedent of a woman exercising religious and political authority at the highest level within the Amarna system, was the precedent that Meritaten would inherit when her mother disappeared from the record, and when she was elevated to the position of great royal wife. The prominence of Nefertiti in the Amarna religious system had implications for Meritaten, because it established a precedent for female religious authority that Meritaten would eventually inherit. When Nefertiti disappeared from the record, an event that occurred in approximately the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, and whose circumstances are fiercely debated by scholars, Meritaten appears to have assumed some of her mother's religious and political functions. She was elevated to the position of great royal wife, a position that, in the context of the Amarna theology, carried not merely political authority, but theological significance, making its holder one of the two human intermediaries through whom the Aten's creative power was manifested in the world. The elevation of Meritaten to the position of great royal wife raises questions that scholars have debated for decades. Questions about the nature of her relationship to her father, about the circumstances of Nefertiti's disappearance, and about the political dynamics of the late Amarna period. Some scholars have argued that Meritaten became Akhenaten's wife in a ceremonial or theological sense, serving as his partner in the religious rituals of the Aten cult, without necessarily entering into a physical marital relationship. Others have argued that the marriage was genuine, that Akhenaten took his eldest daughter as his wife, in the same way that earlier pharaohs had occasionally married their daughters, following the divine model of the creator god, whose reproductive power was not constrained by human conventions of kinship. The debate is unresolved, and the evidence is insufficient to permit a definitive conclusion. What is clear is that Meritaten's status changed dramatically in the later years of Akhenaten's reign, that she moved from the position of eldest princess to the position of great royal wife, assuming a role that placed her at the very center of the Amarna religious and political system. The core problem of Meritaten's story is the condemnation, the collective erasure that swept away not just her memory, but the memory of her entire family, her entire city, her entire religious tradition, and her entire period of Egyptian history. The condemnation did not happen immediately. Akhenaten died around 1336 BC. The exact circumstances of his death are unknown, and was succeeded by a series of rulers whose identities and whose relationships to the Amarna royal family are among the most debated questions in Egyptology. Smenkhkar, a shadowy figure who may have served as Akhenaten's co-regent during the last years of the reign, appears briefly in the record and then vanishes. Neferuaten, a ruler whose throne name is identical to one of Nefertiti's known names, and who may have been Nefertiti herself or Meritaten ruling under a new name or a different individual entirely, appears in the record for a brief and uncertain period. And then Tutankhaten, later Tutankhamun, ascended to the throne as a child, changed his name to remove the reference to the Aten, restored the traditional gods, and began the process of dismantling the Amarna revolution. The question of Meritaten's role during this transitional period, the years between Akhenaten's death and the full restoration of the traditional religion, is one of the most tantalizing and most frustrating mysteries in all of Egyptian history. There is evidence, fragmentary, ambiguous, and subject to multiple interpretations, that Meritaten may have ruled Egypt as pharaoh during this period, either in her own right or as co-regent with Smenkhkar or another figure. The evidence includes inscriptional references to a ruler named Ankheperua Nefertiti, a throne name that some scholars have associated with Meritaten, and dockets on wine jars from Amarna that mention a year 3 of a ruler whose identity has not been conclusively established. If Meritaten did rule Egypt, even briefly, she would be one of only a handful of women in Egyptian history who held pharaonic authority, joining the ranks of Hatshepsut, Sobekneferu, and Tawasret as a female pharaoh whose reign has been either disputed or deliberately obscured by the later historical tradition. But the identification of Meritaten as the ruler Nefertiti is not universally accepted. Other scholars have argued that the ruler was Nefertiti, that the great queen survived her husband's death and ruled Egypt for a brief period before being succeeded by Tutankhaten. Still others have proposed that Nefertiti was a separate individual, a member of the royal family whose identity cannot be determined from the surviving evidence. The debate is ongoing, and new evidence, a new inscription, a new analysis of existing texts, a new archaeological discovery could potentially resolve the question. But for now, the identity of the ruler who governed Egypt in the immediate aftermath of Akhenaten's death remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of Egyptology, the mystery of Smenkhkare, the enigmatic figure who appears briefly in the record as a co-regent or successor of Akhenaten, is directly relevant to Meritaten's story because some scholars believe that Meritaten was married to Smenkhkare and that the two ruled together for a brief period before or after Akhenaten's death. The evidence for this marriage is based primarily on inscriptional references that associate Meritaten's name with that of Smenkhkare, references that are, like so much evidence from the late Amarna period, fragmentary and susceptible to multiple interpretations. If the marriage was real, then Meritaten was not merely a princess elevated to the position of great royal wife, but a queen who shared the throne with a king, a woman whose political authority was exercised in partnership with a co-ruler whose own identity and whose relationship to the Amarna royal family remain among the most debated questions in Egyptology. The identity of Smenkhkare is itself one of the great mysteries of the Amarna period. Some scholars identify him as a son of Akhenaten, possibly by a secondary wife, since no son of Nefertiti is attested in the record. Others identify him as a brother of Akhenaten, possibly a younger son of Amenhotep III, who was elevated to the co-regency in the later years of Akhenaten's reign. Still others have proposed that Smenkhkare was not a separate individual at all but a throne name used by Nefertiti after she assumed a more overtly political role in the late Amarna period. The debate is complicated by the scarcity of the evidence and by the thoroughness of the condemnation that destroyed so much of the record from this period. The late Amarna period, the years between approximately year 12 and year 17 of Akhenaten's reign, was a period of extraordinary upheaval and transformation within the royal family. Nefertiti disappeared from the record. Several of the younger princesses died. Meritaten, the second daughter, is depicted in a mourning scene in the royal tomb at Amarna that suggests she died in childbirth or from complications associated with pregnancy. Smenkhkare appeared as a co-regent. Meritaten was elevated to great royal wife. The entire configuration of the royal family, which had been one of the most stable and most publicly celebrated elements of the Amarna regime, was transformed within a few years by a series of deaths, disappearances, and political reorganizations whose causes and consequences are imperfectly understood. The transformation of the royal family during the late Amarna period had profound implications for Meritaten's position and her fate. As the eldest surviving daughter, the only member of the original royal family whose presence in the record continued uninterrupted through the late Amarna period, Meritaten became the living link between the revolutionary regime and whatever would follow it. She was the connection, the person through whom the authority of the Amarna monarchy could be transmitted to the next generation, the woman whose bloodline connected the future to the past. This made her extraordinarily important and extraordinarily vulnerable. Important because the legitimacy of any successor regime would depend, at least in part, on its connection to the existing royal family. Vulnerable because the condemnation, when it came, would target her precisely because of her centrality. because she was the living embodiment of the revolution, the person whose existence was the most visible reminder that the heretical regime had been real. The transition from the Amarna period to the post-Amarna restoration was not a single event, but a process, a gradual, complex, and politically fraught process of religious restoration, political realignment, and cultural normalization that took place over several years and that involved multiple rulers, multiple factions, and multiple competing visions of what the post-Amarna state should look like. Tutankhaten, the boy who would become Tutankhamun, was probably a son of Akhenaten, though his mother's identity is debated. He ascended to the throne as a child, changed his name to remove the reference to the Aten, and presided over the formal restoration of the traditional gods, a process that was almost certainly managed by the senior officials and priests, who controlled the court rather than by the child, king himself. Meritaten's role during this transition is unclear. She may have served as regent or co-regent during the brief and poorly documented period between Akhenaten's death and the full establishment of Tutankhamun's authority. She may have been the ruler Nefertiti, governing Egypt for 2 or 3 years during the most turbulent transition in its history, or she may have been marginalized, pushed aside by the very officials who were managing the restoration and who had no interest in maintaining the authority of a princess whose name invoked the god they were in the process of condemning. The archaeological evidence for the end of the Amarna period, the period between Akhenaten's death and the full establishment of Tutankhamun's authority, is fragmentary and difficult to interpret, but it suggests a period of confusion, political maneuvering, and gradual institutional transformation that lasted several years. The city of Amarna was not abandoned immediately after Akhenaten's death. Archaeological evidence suggests that the city continued to be inhabited for some time, perhaps several years, after the death of the heretic king. The administration continued to function. The workshops continued to produce goods. The population continued to live in their houses and go about their daily business. The abandonment was gradual rather than sudden, a slow process of depopulation as the court moved back to Thebes and Memphis, and as the economic base that had sustained the city was progressively withdrawn. The gradual abandonment of Amarna provides context for understanding Meritaten's experience during the transitional period. If she remained at Amarna during the early years of the transition, as the North Palace evidence suggests she may have, then she would have witnessed the slow disintegration of the world her father had built. The temples would have grown quieter as the priests departed. The workshops would have slowed as the orders ceased. The streets would have emptied as families left for other cities. The palace would have felt increasingly hollow, its rooms echoing, its gardens untended, its painted walls fading in the desert air. The experience of watching a city die, of seeing the world you grew up in dissolve around you, building by building, street by street, person by person, is an experience that the archaeological record can document, but that only the imagination can fully comprehend. The fate of the Amarna royal tombs adds another dimension to the story of the condemnation. The royal tomb, the large, multi-chambered tomb that was carved into the cliffs east of the city to serve as the burial place of the Amarna royal family, was extensively damaged in antiquity. The walls of the tomb were systematically defaced. The images of the royal family were chiseled away. The inscriptions were mutilated. The scenes of worship and offering that decorated the chambers were deliberately and methodically destroyed. The destruction was not the work of casual vandals. It was systematic and purposeful, carried out by agents of the state who were executing a policy of theological annihilation, a policy designed to deny the heretics the afterlife that their religion had promised them. The sarcophagus of Akhenaten was smashed. The funerary equipment was destroyed or removed. The bodies of the royal family members who had been buried in the tomb were disturbed, their mummies removed, their grave goods scattered, their eternal rest violated by the very people who claimed to be restoring the divine order that the heretics had disrupted. The violation of the royal tombs was the most intimate and the most devastating expression of the condemnation, because it targeted not just the public memory of the heretics, but their private hopes for the afterlife, their most fundamental religious beliefs, and their most profound spiritual vulnerabilities. If Meritaten was buried in the royal tomb at Amarna, and the evidence is unclear, then her burial was almost certainly violated by the agents of the condemnation. Her body would have been disturbed. Her grave goods would have been destroyed or scattered. Her funerary equipment, the objects that were designed to sustain her soul in the afterlife and to ensure her eternal survival, would have been deliberately damaged or removed. The condemnation extended beyond the living into the realm of the dead. It pursued the heretics, not just in this world but in the next, denying them the afterlife that the Egyptian religion regarded as the ultimate purpose of human existence. The question of the Hittite correspondence. The letter from an Egyptian queen requesting a Hittite prince as a husband adds another layer of mystery and tragedy to the story of the late Amarna period and its aftermath. The letter, preserved in the Hittite archives and known to scholars as the Dahamunzu letter, from the Hittite rendering of the Egyptian title Tehemet Nesu, the king's wife, was written by a queen who described herself as alone and afraid, a woman who had no son and who did not wish to marry one of her own subjects. The letter asked the Hittite king Suppiluliuma to send one of his sons to become her husband and the next pharaoh of Egypt. The request was extraordinary, unprecedented in the history of Egyptian-Hittite relations, and indicative of a political crisis of the most extreme kind within the Egyptian court. Suppiluliuma was initially skeptical. He sent an envoy to verify the authenticity of the request before agreeing to send a prince. The prince, Zananza, was sent but was murdered on the journey to Egypt, an event that poisoned Egyptian-Hittite relations for decades, and that contributed to the wars between the two powers that would dominate the foreign policy of the 19th dynasty. The identity of the queen who wrote the Dahamunzu letter remains one of the most debated questions in Near Eastern studies. If the queen was Meritaten, as some scholars have argued, then the letter reveals a woman who was desperate, isolated, and willing to take the most extreme possible measure to secure her position and her survival. The letter reveals a woman who understood the danger she faced, who recognized that the political forces arrayed against her were too powerful to overcome through conventional means, and who sought salvation through an alliance with Egypt's most powerful rival. The letter reveals a woman of extraordinary courage or extraordinary desperation, who was willing to overturn one of the most fundamental conventions of Egyptian kingship in order to survive. The 19th dynasty, the dynasty that succeeded the 18th and that presided over the most thorough phase of the condemnation, had particular reasons for ensuring that the Amarna period was comprehensively erased from the historical record. The founders of the 19th dynasty, Ramesses I and his son Seti I, were not members of the traditional royal family. They were military men who had risen to power through the army, and who needed to establish their legitimacy in the eyes of the Egyptian population and the priesthood. The condemnation of the Amarna period served this purpose. By presenting the Amarna pharaohs as heretics who had betrayed the gods and brought disaster upon Egypt, the 19th dynasty could present itself as the dynasty that had restored the divine order, that had corrected the catastrophic errors of its predecessors, and that therefore deserved the loyalty and the obedience of the Egyptian people. The condemnation was therefore not merely an act of religious piety. It was an act of political legitimation, a strategy by which a new dynasty established its credentials by repudiating its predecessors. The strategy was effective. The 19th dynasty, the dynasty of Seti I and Ramesses II, one of the most powerful and most celebrated dynasties in Egyptian history, built its legitimacy in part on the condemnation of the Amarna period, presenting its own religious devotion and its own military achievements as corrections of the heresy and the neglect that had characterized the preceding decades. The condemnation served the 19th dynasty's interests. Meritaten's erasure served the 19th dynasty's interests, and the interests of the 19th dynasty determined what would be remembered and what would be forgotten for the next 3,000 years. Whatever her role during the transition, Meritaten's fate after the transition was determined by the condemnation. The restoration of the traditional gods required the condemnation of the period that had suppressed them. The condemnation required the erasure of everyone associated with the suppression, and Meritaten, the eldest daughter, the great royal wife, the possible pharaoh, the woman whose name literally meant beloved of the Aten, was the most obviously and the most inescapably associated of all. The restoration stela of Tutankhamun, one of the most important documents from the immediate post-Amarna period, provides direct evidence for the official assessment of the Amarna revolution, and, by extension, for the theological framework within which Meritaten's condemnation was justified. The stela, discovered at Karnak, describes the state of Egypt at the time of Tutankhamun's accession in terms of comprehensive religious and social collapse. The temples were in ruins, the stela declares. The gods had turned their backs on Egypt. The land was in chaos. The army was ineffective. Prayers went unanswered because the gods, the traditional gods, the gods that Akhenaten had suppressed, were angry at the neglect they had suffered during the years of the heresy. The language of the Restoration Stela is the language of condemnation. It presents the Amarna period not as a legitimate reign, but as a catastrophe, not as a religious innovation, but as a theological crime, not as a period of history that deserved to be remembered, but as an aberration that needed to be corrected and then forgotten. The stela does not name Akhenaten. It refers to the Amarna period obliquely, using phrases like the time of trouble and the period of disorder that make clear the official assessment without dignifying the heretical king with the use of his name. The refusal to name is itself a form of condemnation. In the Egyptian religious system, to name a person was to give them power, to acknowledge their existence, to grant them a kind of metaphysical reality. The refusal to name Akhenaten was therefore a refusal to acknowledge his existence, a theological act of annihilation that complemented the physical acts of destruction that were being carried out on his monuments. The Restoration Stela's account of the Amarna period's consequences, the ruined temples, the angry gods, the ineffective army, the unanswered prayers, was almost certainly exaggerated for political purposes. The stela was a propaganda document designed to justify the restoration of the traditional religion and to establish Tutankhamun's legitimacy as the king who had corrected the errors of his predecessors. The exaggeration was deliberate. The worse the Amarna period could be made to appear, the more glorious the restoration would seem, and the more legitimate the new king's claim to the gratitude and the loyalty of the Egyptian people. But the exaggeration, whether deliberate or not, became the official narrative, the story that the Egyptian state told about the Amarna period, and that determined how subsequent generations would understand and evaluate the revolution and everyone associated with it. The narrative was one of unmitigated disaster, of gods betrayed, temples destroyed, social order collapsed, cosmic balance disrupted. The narrative left no room for nuance, for complexity, for the recognition that the Amarna period had also been a time of extraordinary artistic creativity, of innovative theological thinking, and of genuine, if misguided, religious devotion. The narrative was black and white, the revolution was evil, the restoration was good, and everyone associated with the revolution, including Meritaten, whose name literally identified her as a devotee of the condemned god, was contaminated by the evil and deserved to be erased from the record. The physical destruction that accompanied the condemnation was systematic and thorough. The agents of the restoration moved through Egypt methodically, visiting temples, tombs, and monuments to chisel the names of the Amarna royals from the inscriptions. The campaign targeted not just the public monuments, but the private tombs of the officials who had served the Amarna court. The tombs at Amarna, whose walls bore the scenes of the royal family making offerings to the Aten. The campaign targeted the city of Amarna itself. The buildings were dismantled, the stones were removed, the decorative elements were defaced or destroyed. The campaign was comprehensive. It sought to eliminate every trace of the Amarna period from the physical landscape of Egypt, to create a world in which the revolution had never happened and the heretic had never existed. The process of condemnation unfolded in stages rather than as a single dramatic act. The first stage was the religious restoration itself. the reopening of the temples, the reinstatement of the priesthood, the resumption of the traditional rituals and festivals. This stage was initiated under Tutankhamun, or rather, under the officials who governed in his name, and it was presented not as a repudiation of the previous regime, but as a correction, a healing of the damage that the heresy had inflicted on the relationship between Egypt and its gods. The language of the Restoration Stela is diagnostic. It speaks of the gods turning away from Egypt, of prayers going unanswered, of the land falling into disorder. The language implies that the damage was done by the heresy and that the restoration was the cure. But it does not explicitly name the heretics or call for their destruction. The second stage, the active condemnation, the chiseling of names, the demolition of buildings, the removal of the Amarna period from the official chronology, appears to have been initiated under Horemheb, the last king of the 18th dynasty, who came to power after the brief reigns of Tutankhamun and I. Horemheb was a military man, a general who had served under both Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, and who had navigated the turbulent transitions of the late 18th dynasty with considerable political skill. His condemnation of the Amarna period was the most thorough and the most systematic. It was Horemheb who ordered the large-scale demolition of the Aten temples, who appropriated the monuments of Tutankhamun and I, both of whom were tainted by their association with the Amarna period, and who established the chronological framework that would be followed by subsequent dynasties. A framework that dated his own reign from the death of Amenhotep III, effectively erasing the entire Amarna period from the official timeline, the erasure of Meritaten's name from the king lists, the official chronological records that listed the pharaohs of Egypt in sequence from the earliest dynasties to the present, was the most consequential dimension of the condemnation from the perspective of historical memory. The king lists were the primary mechanism by which the Egyptian state maintained its chronological record. They were inscribed on temple walls, written on papyrus, and transmitted from one generation of scribes to the next as the official account of the succession of pharaohs. Removal from the king lists was removal from history. It meant that future generations of scribes, historians, and scholars would have no record of the removed ruler's existence and no basis for including them in the chronological framework that structured the Egyptian understanding of the past. The removal from the king lists was not merely a political act, it was a metaphysical act, an attempt to undo the historical existence of the condemned rulers, to make them not merely dead but non-existent, to retroactively erase them from the sequence of legitimate pharaohs as thoroughly as if they had never been born. The act was comprehensive. It targeted not just Akhenaten but all the rulers of the Amarna period, including Meritaten if she ruled as Nefertiti, and it established a chronological framework that would be followed by all subsequent Egyptian historical writing. The staged nature of the condemnation is significant for understanding Meritaten's fate, because it means that the condemnation was not immediate. There was a period, perhaps 5 to 10 years, between Akhenaten's death and the full implementation of the condemnation, during which the members of the Amarna royal family may have lived in a state of increasing marginalization and vulnerability. Meritaten's possible reign as Nefertiti would have fallen within this window, a period when the religious restoration was underway, but the active condemnation had not yet begun, a period when a member of the Amarna royal family might still have been able to exercise political authority, even as the ideological foundation of that authority was being systematically dismantled. The staged condemnation had consequences that extended across the entire 19th dynasty and beyond. The 19th dynasty pharaohs, Seti I, Ramesses II, and their successors continued and intensified the condemnation initiated by Horemheb. The great building programs of the 19th dynasty were, in part, acts of deliberate erasure. The enormous temples built by Seti and Ramesses used materials quarried from the demolished Amarna temples, their foundations literally incorporating the destroyed remains of the heretical monuments. The Karnak temple complex, which Seti and Ramesses expanded into one of the largest religious structures in the ancient world, contains talatat blocks from the Aten temples embedded in its walls and foundations the physical remains of the condemned buildings serving as the literal foundation for the monuments of the dynasty that condemned them. The irony is profound. The condemnation that was supposed to erase the Amarna period from human memory actually preserved it by incorporating the condemned materials into structures that would survive for millennia. The window closed when Horemheb came to power. The active condemnation that Horemheb initiated left no room for the members of the Amarna royal family. Their names were erased, their monuments were destroyed, and their very existence was denied by the official chronology that Horemheb established. Meritaten, if she was still alive when Horemheb came to power, would have faced the full force of the condemnation. The destruction of her monuments, the erasure of her name, and the denial of her existence by a regime that was determined to ensure that the Amarna period would be forgotten. What is clear, regardless of whether Meritaten ruled as pharaoh, is that her fate was determined by the condemnation that followed the Amarna period. The restoration of the traditional religion was not merely a return to the old ways. It was a repudiation, a deliberate and systematic rejection of everything that the Amarna revolution had represented. The temples of the Aten were dismantled. The city of Amarna was abandoned. The names of the Amarna royals were struck from the monuments and removed from the official king lists. The period was referred to in later documents not by the names of its rulers, but by the phrase, the time of the rebel or the time of the enemy, language that made clear the later dynasties' assessment of the Amarna period as a catastrophe, a betrayal, and a crime against the divine order. The condemnation was comprehensive. It targeted not just Akhenaten, the architect of the revolution, but everyone associated with him. Nefertiti was condemned. The daughters were condemned. The officials who had served the Amarna court were condemned. The artists who had worked in the Amarna temple were condemned. The city itself was condemned, its very stones carrying the taint of heresy, its buildings demolished, and their materials used in the construction of temples dedicated to the restored traditional gods. The condemnation was designed to erase the Amarna period from Egyptian history, to create a seamless narrative in which the reign of Amenhotep III was followed directly by the reign of Horemheb, as if the decades between them had never occurred, as if the revolution had never happened, as if the heretic pharaoh and his family had never existed. And it gets worse, because the condemnation was not merely political, it was theological. In the Egyptian religious system, the erasure of a person's name was the erasure of their existence. Not just their historical existence, but their metaphysical existence, their capacity to persist in the afterlife, their connection to the eternal cycle of creation and renewal that the Egyptian religion was designed to maintain. To erase a name was to kill a soul. To chisel a name from a monument was to condemn the person to non-existence, to deny them the afterlife that every Egyptian believed was the ultimate purpose of human life. The condemnation of the Amarna royals was therefore not merely an act of political retribution. It was an act of metaphysical destruction, a deliberate attempt to annihilate the souls of the heretics, to deny them the eternal life that they had sought to achieve through the worship of the Aten, and to condemn them to the worst fate that the Egyptian religious imagination could conceive: permanent, irrevocable, absolute non-existence. Meritaten was caught in this condemnation. She was not condemned for anything she had done. She was condemned for who she was, the daughter of the heretic, the product of the revolution, a woman whose very existence was a reminder of a period that the restored establishment wished to forget. Her condemnation was collective rather than individual. She was swept away not because of her own actions, but because she belonged to a family, a court, a city, and a religious movement that were collectively rejected by the civilization that succeeded them. Something is wrong with our assumptions when a woman who may have ruled Egypt as pharaoh, who may have been one of only a handful of female rulers in 3,000 years of Egyptian history, has been so thoroughly erased from the record that scholars cannot even agree on whether she ruled at all. Something is wrong with a recording system that could preserve the names and achievements of dozens of male pharaohs while leaving the reign of a possible female pharaoh in a state of ambiguity so profound that it may never be resolved. The ambiguity is not accidental. It is the product of the condemnation. the deliberate, systematic, and theologically motivated destruction of the records of the Amarna period that was carried out by the rulers who succeeded the heretic and who were determined to ensure that the heresy would be forgotten. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The condemnation succeeded. The Amarna period was indeed forgotten, not permanently, but for more than 3,000 years. The king lists of later dynasties skipped the Amarna rulers entirely, passing from Amenhotep III to Horemheb as if the intervening decades had never happened. The historians of the Ptolemaic and Roman periods had no knowledge of the Amarna revolution. It had been so thoroughly purged from the record that the greatest religious upheaval in Egyptian history was completely unknown to the scholars who studied Egyptian history in the centuries after the last pharaoh had died. It was not until the 19th century, when European archaeologists began to excavate the ruins of Amarna and to decipher the inscriptions that survived on the boundary stelae and the tomb walls, that the Amarna period was rediscovered and the names of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their children were restored to the historical record after 3 millennia of imposed silence. Meritaten's story illuminates a pattern of collective erasure that extends far beyond the specific circumstances of the Amarna period, a pattern in which entire generations are swept from the historical record because they were associated with regimes that were subsequently condemned. The first exploration examines the evidence for Meritaten's life during the Amarna period, the scenes, the inscriptions, and the archaeological remains that document her existence as the eldest daughter of the revolutionary pharaoh. The evidence is abundant, more abundant, in fact, than the evidence for many queens and princesses of the Egyptian New Kingdom. Meritaten appears in dozens of scenes from the Amarna period, in the royal tombs at Amarna, in the private tombs of the court officials, on the boundary stelae that mark the limits of the new capital, and on the walls of the temples and palaces that were built to serve the new religion. The scenes show her in a variety of contexts, participating in religious ceremonies, attending state functions, playing with her sisters in the gardens of the royal palace, receiving the blessings of the Aten alongside her parents. The abundance of the evidence is a direct consequence of the Amarna period's distinctive approach to royal representation, an approach that placed the royal family at the center of the artistic program and that depicted the family with a frequency, a prominence, and an intimacy that had no precedent in earlier Egyptian art. The private tombs of the Amarna officials provide some of the most detailed evidence for Meritaten's role in the religious and political life of the court. The tombs were carved into the cliffs that bordered the city of Amarna, their walls decorated with scenes that depicted the tomb owner in the service of the royal family, and that, by extension, documented the activities of the royal family itself. The tombs of officials like Huya, Maria, and Panihisi contain scenes that show Meritaten alongside her parents and her sisters, participating in the elaborate state ceremonies that were the public face of the Aten revolution, riding in chariots through the streets of the new capital, and receiving rewards from the king for the loyalty of the officials who served the court. The boundary stelae of Amarna, the large stone tablets that were erected at the edges of the city to mark its sacred boundaries and to record the king's oath to the Aten, provide another important source of evidence. The stelae include depictions of the royal family, the king, the queen, and their daughters, making offerings to the Aten, and they include inscriptions that list the members of the royal family by name. Meritaten is mentioned prominently on these stelae, her name appearing first among the princesses, her image depicted closest to her parents, her presence confirming her position as the eldest and most important of the royal children.
Cares.
The second exploration concerns the disappearance of Nefertiti and its consequences for Meritaten, because the disappearance of her mother was the event that transformed Meritaten's life from that of a prominent princess to that of a potential ruler. Nefertiti disappears from the record around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, an event that has generated an enormous scholarly literature and that remains one of the most debated questions in Egyptology. The theories range from death by plague to political disgrace to elevation to co-regency under a new name. What is clear is that Nefertiti's disappearance left a void in the Amarna religious system, a void that the system was designed to fill with a specific person, because the theology of the Aten required a male and a female partner to serve as intermediaries between the god and the world. Meritaten appears to have filled this void. After Nefertiti's disappearance, Meritaten's titles changed. She acquired the title Great Royal Wife, the highest female title in the Egyptian hierarchy, the title that designated the woman who served as the king's partner in the religious rituals and the political governance of the state. The acquisition of this title marked a fundamental transformation in Meritaten's position. She was no longer merely a princess, however prominent. She was now the partner of the pharaoh, the female half of the divine dyad that the Aten theology required, the woman through whom the Aten's creative power was manifested in the world alongside the king. The third exploration examines the question of Meritaten's possible reign as pharaoh, the question that is, for most scholars, the most important and the most frustrating aspect of her story. The evidence for Meritaten's possible rule centers on the mysterious figure known as Ankheperu Nefertiti, a ruler whose name appears in a small number of inscriptions from the late Amarna period and whose identity has been the subject of decades of scholarly debate. The throne name Ankheperu means living are the forms of Re, and the personal name Nefertiti means beautiful are the beauties of the Aten, a name that was originally one of Nefertiti's epithets and that was later associated with Meritaten as well. The ruler bearing this name appears to have governed Egypt for a brief period, perhaps 2 to 3 years, during the transition between Akhenaten's death and the accession of Tutankhamun. The scholarly debate over the identity of Nefertiti has produced 3 main candidates. The first is Nefertiti, the theory that the great queen survived her husband and ruled Egypt in her own right under a modified version of her existing names. The second is Meritaten, the theory that the eldest daughter assumed pharaonic authority after her father's death, governing the state during the difficult transition from the Aten religion to the restoration of the traditional gods. The third is that Nefertiti was identical with Smenkhkare, the mysterious co-regent whose relationship to the Amarna royal family is itself the subject of intense scholarly debate. The evidence for Meritaten as Nefertiti includes several suggestive but inconclusive pieces of data. First, the name Nefertiti was associated with Meritaten in earlier inscriptions. It was one of the epithets that she bore during the Amarna period, and its use as a throne name by a subsequent ruler could be interpreted as evidence that the ruler was Meritaten herself. Second, the period of Nefertiti's apparent rule, roughly 2 to 3 years, corresponds to a period when Meritaten would have been in her late teens or early 20s, old enough to exercise political authority. Third, the wine jar dockets from Amarna that mention years of Nefertiti's reign suggest a ruler who was based at or near Amarna, a location that is more consistent with Meritaten, who grew up in the city, than with other candidates who may have had less connection to the site. But the evidence is not conclusive. The identification of Meritaten as Nefertiti remains a hypothesis rather than a proven fact, and the scholarly community remains divided. The division is not merely a reflection of the ambiguity of the evidence. It is a reflection of the success of the condemnation. The fact that the destruction of the Amarna records was so thorough that even the question of who ruled Egypt during one of the most critical transitions in its history cannot be answered with certainty. The fourth exploration examines the condemnation itself, the systematic destruction of the Amarna record that was carried out by the rulers who followed the heretic, and that is the primary cause of Meritaten's obscurity. The condemnation of the Amarna period was one of the most thorough acts of historical destruction in the ancient world. It was not merely a political repudiation, a new regime distancing itself from its predecessor. It was a theological and metaphysical operation, an attempt to undo the damage that the Amarna revolution had inflicted on the cosmic order, to restore the gods that Akhenaten had suppressed, and to erase the memory of the heresy so completely that it could never be revived. The physical dimension of the condemnation was extensive. The temples of the Aten were dismantled, their stones removed and reused as fill material in the construction of temples dedicated to the restored traditional gods. The most famous example is the third pylon at Karnak, where the Talatat blocks, the small, standardized building blocks that were characteristic of Amarna construction, were found embedded in the fill, their painted and inscribed surfaces preserved by the very act of destruction that was intended to eliminate them. The city of Amman itself was abandoned and systematically stripped, its buildings demolished, its decorative elements removed or defaced, its infrastructure allowed to deteriorate until the desert reclaimed the site. The personal names of the Amarna royals were chiseled from the monuments throughout Egypt, not just from the Amarna monuments but from every inscription where the names appeared, in a campaign of erasure that was as systematic and as thorough as any in Egyptian history. The Talatat blocks, the small standardized building blocks that were characteristic of Amarna period construction, provide one of the most remarkable categories of archaeological evidence for the Amarna period and for Meritaten's role within it. The blocks were designed to be small enough for a single worker to carry, roughly 52 centimeters long, 26 centimeters wide, and 24 centimeters high, a standardization that allowed the rapid construction of the massive temple complexes that the Aten revolution required. The blocks were painted and inscribed, their surfaces bearing scenes and texts that documented the religious life of the Amarna court, the rituals of the Aten cult, and the activities of the royal family. When the temples were dismantled during the condemnation, the blocks were reused as fill material in new construction projects, their painted surfaces hidden inside the walls of temples dedicated to the restored traditional gods. The rediscovery of the Talatat blocks in the 20th century was one of the most important developments in the study of the Amarna period. Thousands of blocks were recovered from the fill of the third pylon and other structures at Karnak, their painted surfaces remarkably well preserved by the very act of concealment that had been intended to destroy them. The blocks were studied, photographed, and, through painstaking analysis, reassembled into the scenes from which they had been taken. The reassembled scenes include depictions of the royal family making offerings to the Aten, of the king and queen presiding over state ceremonies, and of the princesses, including Meritaten, participating in the religious and political life of the court. The Talatat blocks are, in effect, a jigsaw puzzle, a puzzle whose pieces were scattered and hidden by the condemnation, and that modern scholars have been patiently reassembling for decades, recovering from the wreckage of the destruction the images and the inscriptions that the destroyers tried to eliminate. The North Palace at Amarna, a large residential complex on the northern edge of the city, provides another important category of evidence for Meritaten's later career. The palace has been associated with Meritaten on the basis of inscriptional evidence. Her name appears on several objects recovered from the site, and the scale and the quality of the complex suggest that it was built for a member of the royal family of the highest rank. The palace was decorated with painted scenes of natural beauty, birds, plants, animals, and landscapes rendered with the distinctive naturalism that characterized Amarna art, and it contained facilities for the keeping of animals, possibly including an aviary, that reflect the Amarna period's particular interest in the beauty and the diversity of the natural world as manifestations of the Aten's creative power. The association of Meritaten with the North Palace has led some scholars to suggest that the palace was her primary residence during the later years of the Amarna period, the period when she had been elevated to the position of great royal wife and when she may have been exercising political authority in her own right. If this interpretation is correct, the North Palace provides a physical context for Meritaten's later career, a specific place where she lived, worked, and exercised whatever authority the circumstances of the late Amarna period had placed in her hands. The palace is now a ruin, its painted walls faded, its floors cracked, its rooms open to the sky. But the ruin preserves, in the fragments that survive, the evidence of a woman who occupied one of the most important residences in the most important city of the most important religious revolution in Egyptian history. The Amarna letters, the diplomatic correspondence that was discovered at the site in the 1880s, provide indirect evidence for the international context in which Meritaten's life was lived. The letters document the diplomatic relationships between the Egyptian court and the rulers of the major powers of the Late Bronze Age, the Hittite Empire, the Kingdom of Mitanni, the kingdoms of Babylon and Assyria, and the smaller states of the Levant and the Aegean. The letters reveal a world of complex international diplomacy, a world of alliances and rivalries, of gift exchanges and marriage negotiations, of territorial disputes and diplomatic protests. The letters also reveal the growing concern of Egypt's vassal states about the stability and the reliability of the Egyptian court. Several letters from the rulers of Levantine city-states complain about the failure of the Egyptian administration to respond to requests for military assistance, complaints that have been interpreted by some scholars as evidence that the Amarna revolution's focus on religious reform came at the expense of effective imperial administration. The diplomatic context is relevant to Meritaten's story because it illustrates the broader consequences of the revolution in which she was raised, consequences that extended far beyond the borders of Egypt and that affected the lives of millions of people across the entire eastern Mediterranean and the ancient Near East. The Amarna Revolution was not merely an internal Egyptian affair. It was an event of international significance, a disruption in the governance of the most powerful state in the region that had consequences for every state that depended on Egyptian power for its security or its prosperity. Meritaten grew up in a court that was the center of this international system, a court where ambassadors arrived from distant kingdoms, where diplomatic marriages were negotiated, where the fate of cities and peoples was decided by the king and his advisors. The world she inhabited was not small. It was vast, stretching from the cataracts of the Nile to the mountains of Anatolia, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the banks of the Euphrates. The scholarly debate about Meritaten's possible reign as pharaoh connects to a broader debate about the nature of political authority in the late Amarna period, a debate that has implications for our understanding not just of Meritaten, but of the entire transition from the Amarna revolution to the restored traditional order. The transition was not smooth. It was not a simple return to the status quo ante, a straightforward restoration of the traditional gods and the traditional political order that had preceded the revolution. The transition involved genuine uncertainty about who would rule, about what policies would be pursued, about how the religious restoration would be managed, and about what would happen to the people who had served the Amarna regime. The uncertainty was political. Multiple factions competed for influence over the young king Tutankhamun and his policies. The uncertainty was also personal. The members of the Amarna royal family, including Meritaten, faced an uncertain and potentially dangerous future in a political environment that was increasingly hostile to everything they represented. The evidence for factional competition during the transition is indirect but suggestive. The senior officials of the late Amarna and early post-Amarna period, men like Ai and Horemheb, appear to have wielded enormous influence over the young king and his policies. Ai, who may have been Nefertiti's father and who held the title God's father, served as a senior advisor during Tutankhamun's reign and eventually succeeded him as pharaoh. Horemheb, a military commander who had served under Akhenaten and who had managed the transition with considerable political skill, succeeded Ai as pharaoh and presided over the most thorough phase of the condemnation. These men were the real power behind the throne. The officials who made the decisions, managed the restoration, and determined the fate of the Amarna royal family. Meritaten's fate was in the hands of men like Ai and Horemheb, men who had served the Amarna regime but who had positioned themselves to survive its collapse, men who understood the political dynamics of the transition and who were prepared to sacrifice the members of the royal family to secure their own positions. The fate of Meritaten, whether she was permitted to live in obscurity, whether she was exiled, whether she was killed, was determined not by her own choices but by the calculations of men who had no loyalty to her and who had every incentive to eliminate anyone whose existence might complicate their own claims to power. The Hittite correspondence provides a remarkable and tantalizing piece of evidence. that may be connected to Meritaten's fate, though the connection is debated and uncertain. A letter from an Egyptian queen to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I, preserved in the Hittite archives at Hattusa, requests that the Hittite king send one of his sons to Egypt to become the queen's husband and the next pharaoh of Egypt. The letter is extraordinary. It represents an unprecedented request for a foreign prince to be placed on the Egyptian throne, a request that implies desperation on the part of the queen who wrote it, and that suggests a political crisis of the first order within the Egyptian court. The queen who wrote the letter has been identified by various scholars as Nefertiti, as Meritaten, or as Akhenaten. The identification depends on the precise dating of the letter and on assumptions about the political circumstances in which it was written. If the letter was written by Meritaten, if she was the queen who desperately sought a foreign husband to protect her position and her life, then the letter is evidence of the danger she faced during the transition and of her willingness to take extraordinary risks to avoid the fate that the condemnation was preparing for her. The fifth exploration concerns the rediscovery of the Amarna period in the 19th century. The archaeological work that brought Meritaten and her family back from the 3,000-year silence of the condemnation. The rediscovery began in the 1880s, when a local Egyptian woman found a cache of clay tablets at the site of Tel El Amarna, the modern name for the ruins of Akhenaten, the abandoned capital of the Aten revolution. The tablets turned out to be diplomatic correspondence, letters exchanged between the Egyptian court and the rulers of foreign powers in the Near East during the reigns of Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. The Amarna letters, as they came to be known, were one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 19th century. They provided a window into the diplomatic world of the Late Bronze Age that was unprecedented in its detail and its breadth, and they alerted scholars to the existence of a period of Egyptian history that the ancient king lists had completely omitted, a period that had been so thoroughly erased from the record that its very existence was a surprise. The systematic excavation of Amarna followed, conducted by a succession of archaeologists including Flinders Petrie, Ludwig Borchardt, and later the Egypt Exploration Society, under the direction of scholars like Barry Kemp. The excavations revealed the remains of the city that Akhenaten had built, the palaces, the temples, the official buildings, the residential quarters, the workmen's village, and the tombs in the cliffs that bordered the site. The discoveries included some of the most famous objects in Egyptian art. The painted bust of Nefertiti, now in the Neues Museum in Berlin, was discovered by Borchardt's team in 1912 in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose at Amarna. The discoveries transformed the understanding of the Amarna period, revealing a world of extraordinary artistic creativity, religious innovation, and political upheaval that the condemnation had tried to erase from human memory. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 by Howard Carter, one of the most famous archaeological discoveries in history, provides indirect but important evidence for the condemnation of the Amarna period and for the fate of the royal family members who were associated with it. The tomb contained an extraordinary collection of funerary objects, gold, jewellery, furniture, chariots, statues, and other treasures that had been buried with the young king, and that had survived intact for more than 3,000 years, because the tomb's entrance had been concealed beneath the debris of later construction. Among the objects in the tomb were several that bore the names of other Amarna royal family members, including objects that had originally been made for Nefertiti, the mysterious ruler who may have been Meritaten. These objects, which included a small gold coffin and other funerary items that had been adapted for use in Tutankhamun's burial, suggest that the funerary equipment of earlier Amarna rulers was repurposed after their condemnation. The repurposing is significant because it implies that the original owners of the equipment were no longer considered worthy of proper burial. Their names were erased from the objects, their images were removed, and their funerary equipment was reassigned to a king whose legitimacy the restored establishment was willing to acknowledge. The presence of repurposed Amarna objects in Tutankhamun's tomb is one of the most poignant categories of evidence for the condemnation, because it demonstrates that the condemnation extended not merely to the public monuments and the official records, but to the most private and the most sacred possessions of the condemned individuals. The funerary equipment that was supposed to sustain Meritaten, or whoever the original owner was, in the afterlife was taken from her and given to someone else. The eternal life that the equipment was designed to provide was denied to the person for whom it was made and granted instead to a person the restored establishment considered more deserving. The canopic jars and other funerary equipment found in tomb KV55 in the Valley of the Kings provide additional evidence for the condemnation and its effects on the Amarna royal family. The tomb, discovered in 1907 by Edward Aten, contained a disturbed burial with funerary equipment that had been modified, defaced, and reassigned in ways that reflect the confusion and the hostility of the post-Amarna period. The names on the equipment had been altered. The original names chiseled away and replaced with others, or simply left blank after the original names were removed. The identity of the person buried in the tomb has been debated for more than a century. Candidates include Akhenaten himself, Smenkhkare, and Tyre, among others, and the debate reflects the thoroughness of the condemnation's destruction of the evidence that would be needed to identify the burial with certainty. The confusion surrounding KV55 is a microcosm of the larger confusion that the condemnation created. The confusion that results when a regime systematically destroys the records that would allow future generations to understand the period it is condemning. The condemnation was designed to create clarity, to establish a clean break between the heretical past and the orthodox present, to draw a bright line between the condemned and the legitimate. But the condemnation actually created the opposite. It created confusion, ambiguity, and uncertainty, because the destruction of the records eliminated the evidence that would have allowed future scholars to reconstruct the sequence of events, the relationships between individuals, and the political dynamics of the period with any confidence. Meritaten's story is embedded in this confusion. The question of whether she ruled as pharaoh, the question of her relationship to Smenkhkare, the question of her fate after the restoration. All of these questions are unanswerable, not because the answers never existed, but because the condemnations destroyed the evidence that contained the answers. The ambiguity that surrounds Meritaten's life is not a natural consequence of the passage of time. It is an artificial consequence of the condemnation, a manufactured uncertainty that was created by the deliberate destruction of the records that would have resolved it. The seventh exploration examines the broader pattern of collective condemnation across human history, the pattern that Meritaten's story exemplifies, and that reveals one of the most persistent and one of the most unjust mechanisms of historical memory. Collective condemnation, the erasure of entire groups because of their association with a condemned regime or ideology, is one of the most common and one of the most destructive mechanisms of historical forgetting. The mechanism operates in every civilization that has experienced a major political or ideological transition. Every civilization where a new regime has sought to establish its legitimacy by repudiating its predecessor and by erasing the memory of the people who served the previous order. The Roman practice of damnatio memoriae, the formal condemnation of a dead emperor's memory, involving the destruction of his statues, the erasure of his name from public inscriptions, and the revocation of the honours that had been bestowed during his time, is the classical parallel to the Egyptian condemnation of the Amarna period, the Chinese practice of historical revision, the systematic rewriting of dynastic histories to reflect the values and the interests of the succeeding dynasty, is another parallel. The modern practice of decommunization in Eastern Europe, the removal of Soviet-era monuments, the renaming of streets and cities, and the revision of school curricula to reflect the post-communist assessment of the Soviet period, is a contemporary example of the same dynamic. In every case, the condemnation targets not just the leaders of the condemned regime, but the people who served it, the officials, the administrators, the soldiers, the artists, the ordinary citizens who participated in the life of the regime, and who are, by the logic of collective guilt, tainted by their association with it. The condemnation does not distinguish between willing collaborators and reluctant participants, between adults who chose to serve the regime and children who were born into it, between people who exercised power and people who merely existed within the system that the condemned power created. The condemnation is indiscriminate. It erases everyone. The comparison between the condemnation of the Amarna period and other historical instances of collective erasure reveals both the universality of the pattern and the specific features that make the Egyptian case distinctive. The Roman practice of damnatio memoriae, the formal condemnation of a deceased emperor's memory, provides the closest classical parallel. When a Roman emperor was condemned, as Caligula, Nero, Domitian, and others were condemned after their deaths, the condemnation involved the destruction of statues, the erasure of names from inscriptions, the revocation of honours, and the formal declaration that the condemned emperor had been an enemy of the state. The parallel with the Egyptian condemnation is striking. Both involve the systematic destruction of the condemned ruler's public memory. Both were motivated by a combination of political calculation and genuine moral outrage, and both were intended to serve as a warning to future rulers about the consequences of tyranny. But the Egyptian condemnation went further than the Roman practice in one crucial respect. It targeted not just the ruler, but the religion. The Roman damnatio memoriae condemned individual emperors, while leaving the religious and institutional framework of the Roman state intact. The Egyptian condemnation condemned an entire religious system. The Aten theology, the temples, the rituals, the artistic conventions, and everything associated with the revolutionary religion. The comprehensiveness of the condemnation was a consequence of the comprehensiveness of the revolution. Because Akhenaten had attempted to transform every dimension of Egyptian life, the condemnation had to address every dimension as well, erasing not just the ruler, but the world the ruler had created. The completeness of the condemnations explains why the Amarna period was forgotten for 3,000 years, while the condemned Roman emperors were never truly forgotten, their names preserved in the historical writings of Tacitus, Suetonius, and other Roman historians, even as their statues were destroyed and their inscriptions erased. The Roman recording system was more distributed than the Egyptian system. It included private literary works that were beyond the reach of official censorship. The Egyptian recording system was more centralized. It was controlled by the state and the priesthood, and the condemnation could therefore be enforced more comprehensively. The result was a more complete erasure, an erasure that succeeded not just in defaming the condemned, but in eliminating them from human knowledge entirely. The destruction of the Aten temples at Karnak during the early 19th dynasty provides particularly vivid evidence for the physical dimension of the condemnation. The temples that Akhenaten had built at Karnak, large, open-roofed structures designed to admit the light of the sun into the ritual spaces, were systematically dismantled by the agents of the restored establishment. The dismantling was methodical. The buildings were taken apart, block by block, their stones sorted and transported to new construction sites where they were reused as fill material in the foundations and walls of temples dedicated to the restored traditional gods. The methodology of the dismantling reflects the seriousness with which the Egyptian state approached the task of condemnation. This was not casual vandalism, but organized, state-sponsored destruction carried out according to a plan and executed with the same efficiency that characterized other Egyptian state projects. The reuse of the talatat blocks as fill material was, from the perspective of the condemned, a particularly devastating form of destruction, because it made the blocks inaccessible without also destroying them. The blocks were hidden inside walls, their painted surfaces turned inward, their inscriptions concealed, their evidence preserved in darkness and silence. The condemnation did not destroy the evidence, it buried it, placing it beyond the reach of anyone who might wish to recover it while simultaneously preserving it for the future that the condemners could not have anticipated. The irony is one of the most striking in all of Egyptian archaeology. The act that was intended to destroy the evidence actually preserved it, creating a time capsule that would be opened 3,000 years later by the archaeologists who dismantled the Karnak walls and recovered the blocks from within. The archaeological work at Amarna has also revealed evidence for the human cost of the revolution, evidence that complicates the simple narrative of religious innovation, and that raises uncomfortable questions about the conditions under which the new city was built and maintained. Analysis of skeletal remains from the Amarna cemeteries has revealed a population that was younger and unhealthier than the average for ancient Egyptian communities, with higher rates of nutritional deficiency, spinal injuries from heavy labor, and premature death. The evidence suggests that the construction of the new capital, the great building project that created the city of the Aten, was accomplished at significant human cost, using a labor force that was overworked, underfed, and subjected to physical demands that exceeded what their bodies could sustain. The human cost of the revolution adds another dimension to the condemnation and to Meritaten's story. The city she grew up in was not merely a monument to religious innovation. It was a monument built on the suffering of the workers who constructed it. Workers whose bones tell a story of hardship and exploitation that the painted walls of the palaces and the temples do not reveal. The beauty of Amarna, the painted floors, the garden scenes, the naturalistic art, was beauty purchased at a price that the official record did not document, but that the ground has preserved. The Amarna period's impact on Egypt's international position is another dimension that the archaeological and textual evidence illuminates. The Amarna letters reveal a world in which Egypt's vassal states were increasingly frustrated by the lack of attention from the Egyptian court. Letters from rulers in the Levant complain about Habiru, raiders, about threats from neighboring kingdoms, and about the failure of the Egyptian administration to respond to their pleas for military assistance. The complaints suggest that the revolution's focus on religious transformation came at the expense of effective imperial governance, that the resources and the attention that should have been devoted to maintaining Egypt's international position were instead directed toward the construction of the new capital and the promotion of the new religion. The reuse of Amarna materials in later construction projects has been documented at numerous sites across Egypt, not just at Karnak but at Hermopolis, Luxor, and other locations where the builders of the 19th dynasty and later periods incorporated Amarna period blocks into their own structures. The geographic distribution of the reused materials reflects the comprehensiveness of the dismantling operation. The Amarna materials were not merely removed from their original locations, but were transported to construction sites across the country, scattered and concealed in a deliberate attempt to prevent their recovery and their reassembly. The connection to Meritaten is direct and devastating. She was not merely defamed, she was not merely condemned. She was eliminated, removed from the chronological sequence of Egyptian rulers, deleted from the king lists, erased from the monuments, and forgotten for 33 centuries. The elimination was so complete that even now, more than a century after the rediscovery of the Amarna period, scholars cannot determine with certainty whether she ruled Egypt as pharaoh. The condemnation did not merely damage the evidence, it destroyed enough of it to make the most fundamental questions about her life unanswerable. Meritaten was erased by this indiscriminate mechanism. She was not a leader of the Amarna revolution. She was not a decision-maker. She was not a theologian or a policy architect or a military commander. She was a child, the eldest daughter of the revolutionary king, raised in the revolutionary theology, formed by the revolutionary culture. Her guilt, the guilt that the condemnation ascribed to her, was the guilt of existence, the guilt of having been born into the wrong family at the wrong moment in history, the guilt of bearing a name that invoked a god the restored establishment had declared an enemy. The guilt was collective, the punishment was collective, and the erasure, the systematic destruction of her name, her image, and her memory was the collective consequence of a collective condemnation that did not pause to consider whether the individuals it targeted deserved the fate it imposed. The question of gender and condemnation, the question of how the collective erasure of the Amarna period affected women specifically and differently from how it affected men, is one that connects Meritaten's story directly to the broader themes of this series. The condemnation of the Amarna period affected both men and women. Akhenaten, Smenkhare, Tutankhamun, and A were all affected by the condemnation, their names erased, or their monuments appropriated by the dynasty that succeeded them. But the women of the Amarna period were affected in ways that were specifically and distinctively damaging, because the condemnation interacted with the existing patriarchal biases of the recording system to produce an erasure that was doubly effective. The women were erased not only because they were associated with a condemned regime, but because the recording system was already predisposed to minimize their visibility. The condemnation provided the motive. The patriarchal conventions provided the mechanism, and the combination produced an erasure that was more complete for women than for men. Akhenaten, despite the condemnation, was never entirely forgotten. Later Egyptian sources referred to him obliquely as the rebel or the enemy of Akhenaten, references that at least acknowledged his existence even as they condemned it. Meritaten received no such acknowledgement. She was not even condemned by name. She was simply ignored, her existence deleted from the record without even the backhanded acknowledgement of a hostile reference. The silence around Meritaten was more complete than the silence around Akhenaten, because the recording system's patriarchal conventions meant that a condemned woman was less likely to be mentioned, even negatively, than a condemned man. The interaction between condemnation and patriarchal bias produced a form of erasure that was greater than the sum of its parts. Condemnation alone would have damaged Meritaten's historical record. Patriarchal bias alone would have diminished it. But condemnation and patriarchal bias together produced an erasure that was virtually total, removing Meritaten from the historical record so completely that even the question of whether she ruled Egypt as pharaoh remains unresolved more than 3,000 years after the events in question. The pattern of Meritaten's condemnation connects to the broader taxonomy of erasure that this series has documented, but it adds a new dimension that the previous forms did not capture. The chisel, the silence, the narrative, the abstraction, the absorption, the displacement, all of these forms operate on individuals or on specific categories of individuals. The condemnation operates on groups, on families, on courts, on cities, on entire periods of history. The condemnation is the most comprehensive form of erasure because it targets not just the person but the context, not just the individual but the entire world in which the individual lived. The chisel removes a name. The condemnation removes an era. The sixth exploration examines what the condemnation tells us about the nature of collective erasure, the form of erasure that targets not individuals but groups, not specific achievements but entire periods, not particular women but every woman associated with a condemned regime. The condemnation of the Amarna period was collective in the most comprehensive sense. It targeted everyone: the king, the queen, the princesses, the officials, the priests, the artists, the bureaucrats, every person who had participated in the revolution or who had benefited from the revolutionary regime. The condemnation did not distinguish between the architect of the revolution and the people who were born into it. It did not distinguish between Akhenaten, who had chosen to overthrow the traditional gods, and Meritaten, who had been born into the revolution and had had no choice in the matter. The condemnation was indiscriminate. It swept away the guilty and the innocent, the leaders and the followers, the adults who had made choices and the children who had been too young to choose. Meritaten was a child of the revolution. She did not choose to be born into the most radical religious experiment in Egyptian history. She did not choose to grow up in a city that was built to serve a god her father had invented. She did not choose to participate in the rituals of a religion that she had been taught from infancy to believe was the truth. She was born into a world that her father had created, and when that world was condemned, she was condemned along with it. The condemnation did not ask whether Meritaten deserved to be erased. It did not inquire into her personal beliefs, her personal choices, or her personal responsibility for the revolution that her father had launched. It simply erased her, along with everyone else who bore the taint of the Amarna heresy. Step back now from the specific details of the Amarna revolution and the condemnation that followed it. Step back from the scholarly debates about Nefertiti and the boundary stelae and the Talatat blocks. Step back from the specific story of Meritaten, the princess, the possible pharaoh, the condemned daughter of a condemned king, and look at what her story reveals about the deepest structures of collective memory and the mechanisms by which entire generations can be swept from the historical record. What does it mean to be condemned? Condemnation is not the same as any of the other forms of erasure that this series has documented. The chisel targets individuals, the silence targets categories, the narrative targets reputations, the abstraction targets identities, the absorption targets innovations, the displacement targets positions. But condemnation targets everything. It targets individuals, categories, reputations, identities, innovations, positions, and the very period of time in which they existed. Condemnation does not merely erase a person from the record, it erases the era. It creates a hole in time, a gap in the chronological sequence that is filled not with information but with silence, not with names but with epithets, like the rebel and the enemy, not with history but with condemnation. Let that sink in. The condemnation of the Amarna period created a hole in Egyptian history that lasted for more than 3,000 years. The period between Amenhotep III and Horemheb, a period of roughly 30 years that included some of the most dramatic events in Egyptian history, was simply deleted from the official record. The king lists skipped it. The later historians did not know about it. The civilization that had produced the revolution forgot that the revolution had ever happened. The forgetting was so complete that when the Amarna period was rediscovered in the 19th century, it came as a genuine surprise to the scholars who had spent their careers studying Egyptian history. They had studied a civilization for decades without knowing that one of its most extraordinary episodes had been deliberately concealed from them. The success of the condemnation raises a question that is both historical and philosophical, a question about the nature of historical knowledge and the degree to which our understanding of the past is shaped by the decisions of ancient censors who determined what would be preserved and what would be destroyed. How much of what we think we know about Egyptian history is the product of such decisions? How many other episodes, other revolutions, other crises, other transformations have been successfully erased from the record, leaving no trace that would allow modern scholars to detect their absence? The Amarna period was rediscovered because the physical remains of the city survived. The ruins at Tel El Amarna provided the evidence that the textual record had been designed to conceal. But what about episodes that left no physical remains? Episodes that occurred in cities that were not abandoned in the desert, but that continued to be inhabited and rebuilt, their earlier layers buried beneath the accumulated deposits of centuries of subsequent occupation. What about episodes that were erased not just from the textual record, but from the physical landscape as well? The answer is sobering. We do not know. We cannot know. The success of a condemnation is measured by its invisibility, by the degree to which the condemned period has been erased so thoroughly that no trace remains to indicate that anything has been lost. The Amarna condemnation was almost perfectly successful. It would have been perfectly successful if the city had not been built in a desert location that ensured the preservation of its ruins after its abandonment. The condemnation succeeded textually. The king lists were altered, the inscriptions were defaced, the names were erased. It failed physically because the desert preserved what the censors had tried to destroy. This is not science fiction. This is the actual condition of historical knowledge, a knowledge that is shaped not merely by what happened but by what the recording systems chose to preserve, what the censors chose to destroy, and what the accidents of preservation happened to save. The Amarna period exists in the modern historical record because the desert preserved the evidence. Other periods that may have been equally dramatic, equally important, and equally thoroughly condemned, may be permanently lost, their very existence unknown to the scholars who study the civilizations that produced them. Let that sink in. The experience of being the child of a condemned regime, of growing up inside a system of belief that is subsequently declared false and criminal, is an experience that connects Meritaten countless individuals across human history who have found themselves on the wrong side of a political or ideological transition. The experience is characterized by a specific and devastating form of loss. The loss not merely of power or status but of meaning, of the framework within which one's entire life has been understood and interpreted. The child of a condemned regime loses not just their position in society, they lose their understanding of the universe. Because the understanding they were given, the beliefs they were taught, the values they were raised to hold, are declared to be not merely wrong but dangerous, not merely mistaken but criminal, not merely outdated but evil. Meritaten's experience of this loss must have been total. The Aten theology was not merely a set of beliefs she held. It was the entirety of her worldview, the framework within which she understood the nature of reality, the purpose of human life, the relationship between the human and the divine, and her own place in the cosmic order. When the theology was condemned, everything she understood about the world was condemned along with it. The sun that she had been taught to worship as the sole creator of all life was declared to be merely one god among many. The father she had been taught to revere as the Aten's sole representative on earth was declared to be a heretic and an enemy. The city she had grown up in was declared to be a monument to falsehood. The rituals she had performed since childhood were declared to be abominations. The very name she bore, beloved of the Aten, was declared to be a mark of guilt rather than a mark of identity. The question of what Meritaten believed, whether she remained a devotee of the Aten throughout her life, or whether she accommodated herself to the restoration of the traditional gods, is one that the evidence cannot answer, but that the imagination cannot avoid. The transition from the Aten religion to the restored polytheistic system must have been, for the members of the Amarna royal family, an experience of extraordinary psychological complexity. They had been raised in a religion that told them the traditional gods were false, that Amun, Osiris, Isis, and the rest of the vast Egyptian pantheon were illusions, that the only true god was the Aten, and that their father was the Aten's sole representative on earth. And now that religion was being condemned. The gods their father had declared false were being declared true. The temples their father had closed were being reopened. The rituals their father had abolished were being restored. Everything they had been taught to believe was being reversed, and the reversal was being enforced by the same institutional authority that had previously enforced the revolution. The psychological impact of this reversal on the children of the revolution, on Meritaten, on Akhenaten, who would become Akhenaten as the wife of Tutankhamun, on any surviving members of the Amarna royal family, must have been profound. They were being asked to abandon the only religion they had ever known, to worship gods they had been taught to reject, to participate in rituals they had been taught to despise, and to accept that the world their father had built, the city, the temples, the theology, the entire cosmological framework within which they had been raised, was a lie. The demand was not merely political, it was existential, a demand that they reconstruct their entire understanding of the universe, their relationship to the divine, and their sense of who they were and what their lives meant. The desert that preserved the ruins of Amarna, the desert that saved the evidence the condemnation tried to destroy, is itself a kind of archive, a record-keeping system that operates by different principles than the human recording systems that this series has examined. The human recording systems are selective. They choose what to preserve and what to discard. They apply categories and conventions that determine whose stories are told and whose are forgotten. They embed the biases and the assumptions of their creators in every document they produce. The desert is not selective. The desert preserves everything that is buried within it, impartially, indiscriminately, without bias or convention or assumption. The desert does not care whether a name was condemned or celebrated, whether a person was a heretic or a saint, whether a building was a temple of the one true God or a monument to a false religion. The desert simply preserves, holding the evidence in its dry embrace until someone comes to dig it up and to read the story it contains. We do not know how Meritaten responded to this demand. We do not know whether she embraced the restoration with genuine conviction, accommodated herself to it with pragmatic resignation, or resisted it in some form that the record does not preserve. The record, What remains of it after the condemnation does not document her response. It does not even acknowledge that the demand was made. The record simply presents the restoration as a return to the natural order, as if the traditional gods had always been true, as if the Aten revolution had been nothing more than a temporary interruption in the eternal continuity of the Egyptian religious system, as if the children who had been raised in the revolution could simply be expected to switch their allegiance without confusion, without grief, and without any of the psychological turmoil that accompanies the destruction of a belief system. The question of historical justice, the question of whether the condemnation of the Amarna period was justified, and whether the erasure of its principal figures was morally defensible, is one that modern scholars have approached with increasing discomfort. The early scholarly tradition, shaped by the assumptions of the 19th and early 20th centuries, tended to accept the condemnation at face value, viewing Akhenaten as a misguided fanatic whose religious innovations had disrupted the stable and benevolent order of the traditional Egyptian state. More recent scholarship has been more sympathetic to the Amarna revolution, recognizing its theological creativity, its artistic innovation, and its genuine, if ultimately unsuccessful, attempt to transform the religious foundations of Egyptian civilization. The reassessment of the Amarna revolution has implications for the assessment of Meritaten's condemnation. If the revolution was not merely a crime against the divine order, but a genuine attempt at religious and cultural transformation, however misguided, however disruptive, however ultimately unsuccessful, then the condemnation of the people associated with it takes on a different character. It becomes not a just punishment for a crime, but an unjust persecution of individuals who participated in a legitimate, if controversial, political and religious movement. The distinction matters because it affects how we understand Meritaten's erasure and how we evaluate the justice or injustice of the system that produced it. The modern world offers numerous parallels to the condemnation of the Amarna period, parallels that illuminate the dynamics of collective erasure and that connect Meritaten's ancient experience to contemporary realities. The de-Stalinization of the Soviet Union, the process by which the memory and the legacy of Joseph Stalin were systematically revised after his death, involved many of the same mechanisms that characterized the condemnation of the Amarna period: the removal of names from public spaces, the revision of official histories, the rehabilitation of some condemned individuals, and the continued erasure of others. The denazification of Germany after the Second World War involved similar dynamics: the systematic repudiation of a condemned regime, the destruction of its symbols, and the complicated question of how to treat the individuals who had participated in the regime, whether as willing collaborators or as people who had been caught up in historical circumstances beyond their control. The parallels are not exact. The Amarna revolution was not equivalent to Stalinism or Nazism in its moral character or in its consequences, but the structural dynamics of condemnation, the dynamics by which a condemned regime's associates are swept from the record, the dynamics by which collective guilt is imposed on individuals who may have had little choice in their association with the regime, the dynamics by which the children of condemned leaders are punished for the actions of their parents, are remarkably consistent across these very different historical contexts. The dynamics are structural, they are institutional, they are the product of systems that operate on groups rather than on individuals, and that produce collective consequences regardless of individual circumstances. The grief moment of Meritaten's story is the realization that she was condemned for something she did not choose. She did not choose to be born into the Amarna revolution. She did not choose the Aten as her god. She did not choose to live in the city of Akhenaten. She did not choose to bear a name that invoked the deity her father had placed at the center of the universe. These choices were made for her, by her father, by the circumstances of her birth, by the theology into which she was initiated before she was old enough to understand what it meant. And when the theology was condemned, when the gods that her father had suppressed were restored, and the God that her father had worshipped was rejected, Meritaten was condemned along with the theology. Her condemnation was not personal, it was associative. she was guilty by association, guilty of being the daughter of a heretic, guilty of being the product of a revolution, guilty of bearing a name that invoked a god that the restored establishment had declared an enemy. The modern rediscovery of the Amarna period has produced a reassessment of the condemnation that would have been unthinkable to the ancient Egyptians who carried it out. The heretic king who was condemned as the enemy of the gods has become one of the most studied and most discussed rulers in ancient history. The city that was supposed to be forgotten forever has become one of the most important archaeological sites in Egypt. The art that was condemned as aberrant has become some of the most admired and most frequently reproduced art in the Egyptian canon. The revolution that was supposed to be erased from human memory has become one of the most famous episodes in the history of human civilization. The condemnation failed, not in its immediate purpose, which was to restore the traditional gods and eliminate the memory of the heresy, but in its long-term purpose, which was to ensure that the heresy would never be known again. The failure of the condemnation is itself a form of justice, a posthumous vindication of the people who were condemned, a recognition that the censors who tried to erase the Amarna period from human memory did not have the final word. The desert had the final word. The ground had the final word. The patient, impartial, comprehensive archive of the earth, which preserves everything that is buried within it, regardless of what the censors decree, had the final word. And the final word was, the condemnation was wrong. The heretics were real. They existed. They built a city and a religion and a culture that, however controversial and however ultimately unsuccessful, deserved to be remembered rather than destroyed. Meritaten is part of this posthumous vindication. She is one of the people the condemnation tried to erase, one of the names the censors tried to eliminate, one of the images the agents of destruction tried to chisel from the stone. And she has been recovered, not completely, not perfectly, but genuinely. Her name has been read, her image has been identified. Her story has been reconstructed, however imperfectly, from the fragments that the condemnation failed to destroy. The condemnation succeeded for 3,000 years. The recovery has been underway for barely 2 centuries. But the recovery is real, and every fragment recovered, every name restored, every image identified is a small victory against the forces of collective erasure that tried to eliminate an entire generation from the memory of human civilization. The earth holds what the recording systems cannot be trusted to preserve. The ground beneath Amarna holds the remains of the city that Akhenaten built and that the condemnation tried to erase. The foundations, the floors, the pottery, the tools, the small objects of daily life that tell the story of a world the censors wanted forgotten. The ground is the final archive, the archive that cannot be censored, that cannot be selectively edited, that cannot be purged of inconvenient information by political authorities determined to control the narrative of the past. The Amarna period's emphasis on the beauty of the natural world, the birds, the flowers, the fish, the animals that fill the painted surfaces of the palaces and the tombs, was not merely an aesthetic choice. It was a theological statement, an expression of the Aten theology's central claim that the natural world was itself a manifestation of the divine creative power. The beauty that Meritaten grew up surrounded by, the painted gardens, the naturalistic scenes, the joyful depictions of life in all its variety, was beauty with a theological purpose, beauty designed to demonstrate the Aten's generosity and the world's dependence on the sunlight that the solar disk provided. The question of what Meritaten would have wanted, how she would have wished to be remembered, what story she would have told about her own life, is unanswerable, but worth considering. Would she have wished to be remembered as the daughter of a heretic, as the possible pharaoh whose reign was too brief and too poorly documented to be confirmed, as the victim of a condemnation she did not deserve? Or would she have wished to be remembered as the beloved of the Aten, the child of the god, the princess of the Sun City, the woman who grew up in the most extraordinary religious experiment in human history, and who lived the theology her father created with a conviction that the condemnation could destroy, but could not disprove? The taxonomy of erasure that this series has constructed across its many episodes reaches its final and most comprehensive form with the addition of condemnation. The taxonomy now includes 7 mechanisms, 7 distinct ways in which the achievements and the lives of women have been systematically lost across 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization. The first mechanism is the chisel, the physical destruction of a woman's record, exemplified by the erasure of Hatshepsut's name and image from the monuments of the 18th dynasty. The second is silence, the structural omission that occurs when the recording system fails to document a woman's life, exemplified by the absence of biographical information about Tyre-Mereniset. The third is narrative, the deliberate distortion that replaces the real woman with a fictional character, exemplified by the transformation of Cleopatra from a sophisticated political strategist into a seductive temptress. The fourth is abstraction, the symbolic dissolution that preserves a name while dissolving the person, exemplified by the transformation of Berenice II from a flesh and blood queen into a constellation. The fifth is absorption, the institutional consumption that occurs when a woman's innovations become so successful that they become invisible, exemplified by the disappearance of Arsinoe II inside the institutions she created. The sixth is displacement, the marginalization that occurs when one woman's elevation requires another's diminishment, exemplified by the displacement of Iset by Hatshepsut. And the seventh, the final mechanism, the most comprehensive form of erasure, is condemnation, the collective erasure that sweeps away entire generations because they were associated with a regime that was subsequently condemned. The erasure that targets not individuals but eras, not specific achievements but entire periods of history, not particular women, but every woman who had the misfortune to be born into the wrong family, in the wrong city, at the wrong moment in history. Meritaten is the embodiment of this mechanism, the woman who was condemned not for what she did, but for who she was, not for her choices but for her circumstances, not for her guilt but for her association. The associative nature of the condemnation connects Meritaten's story to a broader pattern that recurs throughout human history, the pattern in which the children and the associates of condemned individuals are punished for the actions of the condemned. The pattern is visible in every civilization that has practiced collective punishment, from the ancient Near Eastern practice of destroying a rebel's entire family to the modern practice of guilt by association that has characterized authoritarian regimes across the 20th and 21st centuries. The pattern is unjust. It punishes the innocent for the actions of the guilty. It treats individuals not as persons with their own moral agency, but as extensions of the groups to which they belong, as carriers of a collective guilt that cannot be expiated by individual innocence. Look at the ruins of Amarna, the low mounds and the scattered foundations that are all that remain of the city that Akhenaten built and that the condemnation destroyed. The ruins stretch for kilometers along the east bank of the Nile, barely visible against the desert landscape, their outlines discernible only from the air or through the trained eyes of an archaeologist who knows where to look. The city that was once the capital of the most powerful state in the ancient Near East. The city where Meritaten played as a child, where she watched her father make offerings to the Aten, where she was elevated to the position of great royal wife, where she may have ruled as pharaoh, is gone. Its palaces are rubble, its temples are dust, its painted floors have faded, its inscriptions have been chiseled away. The city exists now only as an archaeological site, a place where scholars dig in the sand and piece together, from the fragments they recover, the story of a world that was deliberately and systematically destroyed. The destruction was not accomplished by time alone. Time would have taken the city eventually. The desert is patient, and 5,000 years of wind and sand would have buried any settlement, however solidly built. But the destruction of Amarna was not patient. It was deliberate. It was carried out by human hands, by the workers who dismantled the temples and carried away the stones, by the artisans who chiseled the names from the monuments, by the administrators who ordered the abandonment of the city and the relocation of its population. The destruction was an act of policy, a decision made at the highest levels of the Egyptian state that the city and everything it represented must be erased from the landscape and from the memory of the civilization. The implications of this deliberate destruction extend far beyond the specific case of Amarna. They raise questions about the nature of historical memory itself, about the degree to which our knowledge of the past is the product of deliberate choices about what to preserve and what to destroy. Every civilization makes these choices. Every recording system embeds these choices in its structure, in the categories it uses, the conventions it follows, the assumptions about value that determine what is documented and what is not. The condemnation of the Amarna period is an extreme example of these choices, an example in which the decision to destroy was explicit, deliberate, and comprehensive. But the same dynamic operates, in subtler forms, in every recording system that has ever existed, in the choices about what to include and what to exclude, about whose stories are worth telling and whose can be safely ignored, about which periods of history are worth remembering, and which can be allowed to fade into oblivion. The ruins of Amarna are still there, still visible, still accessible, still yielding evidence to the archaeologists who continue to excavate the site and to study the thousands of objects and inscriptions that have been recovered from it over the past century and a half. The site is one of the most important in all of Egyptian archaeology, not merely because of the famous objects it has produced, the bust of Nefertiti, the Amarna letters, the boundary stele, but because it provides a uniquely complete snapshot of an ancient Egyptian city at a specific moment in time. Unlike other Egyptian cities, which were continuously inhabited for centuries or millennia, and whose earlier levels were buried and transformed by subsequent building, Amarna was occupied for a single generation, and then abandoned. Its buildings preserved in a state that reflects the specific conditions of the Amarna period rather than the accumulated modifications of centuries of subsequent use. The preservation of Amarna is in a profound sense the failure of the condemnation, the physical evidence that the censor's attempt to erase the Amarna period from human memory was ultimately unsuccessful. The buildings were dismantled, the stones were carried away, the inscriptions were defaced, but the foundations remained, the floors remained, the debris of daily life, the pottery, the tools, the food remains, the small objects that tell the story of ordinary existence, remained in the ground, waiting for the archaeologists who would come 3,000 years later to recover them and to reconstruct, from these humble fragments, the story of the world that the condemnation had tried to destroy. The story of Meritaten is part of this larger story, the story of recovery, of reconstruction, of the patient, meticulous work of scholars who have spent their careers piecing together the fragments of the Amarna period and restoring to human knowledge a chapter of history that was supposed to have been permanently erased. The recovery is not complete. It will never be complete. The condemnation was too thorough, the destruction too systematic, and the passage of time too corrosive for a full recovery to be possible. But the recovery is real, it is ongoing, and every new discovery, every new inscription read, every new scene reconstructed, every new connection made between the scattered fragments of the Amarna record adds to our understanding of the period and of the people who lived through it. The condemnation of the Amarna period was also, in a profound sense, a condemnation of the women who lived through it. Nefertiti, one of the most powerful and most prominent women in Egyptian history, was condemned along with her husband. Meritaten, the eldest daughter, the possible pharaoh, was condemned along with her father. The younger princesses, Mekete, Akhenaten, Nefertiti Tasherit, Nefertiti Setapenre, were condemned along with their family. The condemnation did not spare anyone. It did not make exceptions for youth, for innocence, for the simple biological accident of being born into the wrong family at the wrong time. The modern parallel to Meritaten's experience is found in every society that has undergone a rapid and comprehensive ideological transition. Every society where the children of one regime are required to live under the assumptions of the regime that condemned it. The children of the Soviet elite who came of age after the collapse of communism. The children of colonial administrators who were raised in the assumptions of empire and who lived to see those assumptions repudiated. The children of any authoritarian regime who were raised within its ideology and who were then required to adapt to the ideology that replaced it. The experience is universal, and it is universally traumatic because it requires the individual to either abandon the beliefs they were raised with or to maintain those beliefs in secret at the cost of permanent alienation from the society in which they live. Meritaten's condemnation was the ancient equivalent of this modern experience, the experience of being born into the wrong ideology, at the wrong time, in the wrong family, the experience of inheriting a set of beliefs that would later be declared criminal, the experience of bearing a name, beloved of the Aten, that would later be treated as evidence of guilt rather than as a mark of identity. The experience of growing up in a world that was, by the standards of the world that succeeded it, entirely and comprehensively wrong, and of being held responsible for the wrongness not because of anything she had done but because of who she was and where and when she had been born. The injustice of collective condemnation is that it treats individuals as extensions of the groups to which they belong, rather than as persons with their own moral agency and their own capacity for choice. Meritaten was not the Aten revolution. She was a person who was born into it. She was not the heresy. She was a child who was raised within it. She was not the enemy of the traditional gods. She was a woman who had never been given the opportunity to worship them. The condemnation did not make these distinctions. It did not need to. The condemnation was collective. It targeted the group, the family, the era, the entire world of the Amarna period. And individuals within the group were erased not because of their individual guilt, but because of their collective association. The modern archaeological study of the Amarna period continues to produce new discoveries and new insights that challenge and refine our understanding of the revolution and its aftermath. Recent excavations at Amarna, conducted under the direction of Barry Kemp and the Amarna Project, have focused on the daily life of the city's ordinary inhabitants, using the evidence of the residential quarters, the workshops, and the workman's village to reconstruct the social and economic conditions of life during the revolution. The findings paint a more complex picture of the Amarna period than the traditional narrative of royal heresy and divine punishment would suggest. A picture in which the revolution was experienced differently by different segments of the population, in which the break with tradition was never as complete as the official ideology demanded, and in which the ordinary people of Amarna navigated the extraordinary circumstances of the revolution with the same mixture of compliance, resistance, and pragmatic adaptation that ordinary people have always brought to the extraordinary demands of revolutionary regimes. The ongoing nature of the archaeological work at Amarna means that the story of Meritaten and the story of the Amarna period as a whole is not yet complete. New evidence may yet be discovered that will resolve the long-standing debates about Meritaten's possible reign as pharaoh, about the circumstances of Nefertiti's disappearance, about the identity of Smenkhkare, and about the fate of the Amarna royal family during the transition to the restored traditional order. The possibility of new discovery keeps the story alive. It means that the condemnation did not have the final word, that the censors who tried to erase the Amarna period from human memory were defeated not just by the discoveries of the past, but by the discoveries that are still to come. The work of the Amarna project under Barry Kemp has been particularly significant for expanding our understanding of the city and its inhabitants beyond the narrow focus on the royal family that characterized earlier archaeological work at the site. Kemp's excavations have examined the residential quarters of the city, the workshops where artisans produced the goods that sustained the court and the population, the cemeteries where ordinary Amarns were buried, and the infrastructure, the roads, the wells, the storage facilities that supported daily life in the new capital. The findings have revealed a city that was, in many ways, more ordinary than the revolutionary ideology of its founder would suggest. A city where people lived, worked, raised children, fell ill, and died in patterns that were not dramatically different from the patterns of life in other Egyptian cities of the same period. The ordinariness is itself a revelation, because it challenges the narrative of the Amarna period as a time of unrelieved crisis and upheaval. The lives of ordinary Amarnans were shaped by the revolution, but they were not defined by it. People still needed to eat, to work, to care for their families, to navigate the practical demands of daily existence. The revolution was the backdrop against which these ordinary activities took place. But it was not the whole story, and the recognition that ordinary life continued, even during the most radical religious revolution in Egyptian history, complicates the simple narrative of heresy and condemnation that the restored establishment sought to impose. The collective nature of the condemnation adds a new dimension to the taxonomy of erasure that this series has documented, a dimension that reveals how political power operates not merely on individuals but on groups, not merely on specific achievements, but on entire eras, and not merely on the guilty, but on everyone associated with the guilty. The condemnation is the most comprehensive form of erasure because it targets not just the person, but the context, not just the individual, but the entire social, political, and religious world in which the individual lived. The chisel removes a name, the condemnation removes a world. There was once a girl who grew up in a city built for a god. The city was called Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten, and it stretched for 12 kilometers along the east bank of the Nile in the desert of Middle Egypt. The city was beautiful. Its palaces were decorated with paintings of birds and flowers and fish swimming in pools. Its temples were open to the sky, roofless structures designed so that the light of the sun could pour down upon the altars where the king and queen made their offerings. Its streets were wide and straight, its buildings white against the sand, its gardens green with the life that the Nile's water made possible even in the desert. The girl's name was Meritaten, beloved of the Aten. She was the eldest daughter of the pharaoh Akhenaten and the queen Nefertiti. She was born into a revolution that abolished the old gods, closed the ancient temples, and placed a single deity, the visible disk of the sun, at the center of the Egyptian universe. She grew up watching her father worship the Aten. She learned the hymns. She performed the rituals. She stood beside her parents beneath the rays of the sun and received the tiny hands that reached down from the disk to offer her the symbol of eternal life. She did not choose the revolution. She was born into it. She did not choose the god. She was given his name. She did not choose the city. She was brought there as a child. Everything about her life, her name, her religion, her home, her family, her position in the hierarchy of the court, was determined by the choices of adults who had made their decisions before she was old enough to understand what they meant. And when the revolution was condemned, when the old gods were restored, when the temples were reopened, when the city was abandoned and its buildings pulled down and its stones carried away, Meritaten was condemned along with it. Her name was struck from the record, her image was defaced, her existence was denied. The girl who had been one of the most prominently depicted individuals in all of Egyptian art became one of the most thoroughly erased. Her name removed from the king lists, her image chiseled from the monuments, her story buried beneath 3,000 years of imposed silence. The silence lasted until the 19th century, when archaeologists came to the ruins of Amarna and began to dig. They found the boundary stelae with their inscriptions intact. They found the private tombs with their scenes of the royal family. They found the painted floors, the diplomatic correspondence, the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose with the famous bust of Nefertiti, still sitting on a shelf where it had been left when the city was abandoned. They found Meritaten, her name, her image, her presence in the art, and the inscriptions of a period that the ancient world had tried to erase from human memory. The condemnation failed. Not completely. Meritaten remains obscure, her fate uncertain, her possible reign as pharaoh unconfirmed. But the condemnation failed in its fundamental purpose. The purpose of erasing the Amarna period from human knowledge forever. The period was rediscovered. The names were read. The stories were reconstructed. And the girl who was condemned for the choices of her father is at last being seen, not as a heretic, not as an enemy, not as a carrier of collective guilt, but as a human being who was born into extraordinary circumstances and who navigated those circumstances with whatever resources she possessed. Her fate remains unknown. We do not know when she died. We do not know where she was buried. We do not know whether her body received the funerary rites that the Egyptian religion considered essential for the survival of the soul in the afterlife, or whether the condemnation extended even to the treatment of her remains, denying her in death the dignity that the displacement had denied her in life. The questions are unanswerable, the silence is complete, and the completeness of the silence is the final expression of the condemnation. The expression that says, more eloquently than any inscription or any monument, this person was not merely forgotten. This person was deliberately destroyed. This person's very existence was treated as a contamination that had to be purged from the memory of the civilization. But the desert remembered, the ground held the evidence, and the patient work of archaeologists, generation after generation of scholars who dug in the sand at Amarna and read the inscriptions and reassembled the Talatat blocks and pieced together the story from the fragments that the condemnation had failed to destroy, has brought Meritaten back from the darkness of 3,300 years of imposed silence. The taxonomy of erasure documented across this series has reached its final form. The chisel, the silence, the narrative, the abstraction, the absorption, the displacement, and now condemnation, the collective erasure that sweeps away entire generations because they were associated with regimes that were subsequently rejected. 7 mechanisms, 7 forms of forgetting, 7 ways in which the achievements and the lives of women have been systematically lost across the full span of ancient Egyptian civilization. The question that Meritaten's story leaves us with is a question about the nature of justice across time, about whether the passage of centuries can correct the injustices that were committed in the name of theological purity and political expediency. The condemnation was unjust. The collective erasure of an entire generation because of the religious choices of its leader was a violation of the most basic principles of individual moral responsibility. The condemnation punished children for the actions of their father. It erased the innocent along with the guilty. It denied individuals the right to be judged on their own merits, rather than on the merits of the group to which they belonged. The rediscovery of the Amarna period is a partial correction of this injustice, a restoration of names that were supposed to be forgotten, a recovery of images that were supposed to be destroyed, a reconstruction of a world that was supposed to be erased from human memory forever. The correction is partial, it is imperfect, it cannot undo the 3,000 years of silence that the condemnation imposed. It cannot restore the afterlife that the destruction of the royal tombs was designed to deny. It cannot give Meritaten back the life that the condemnation took from her. The life of a woman who might have been a pharaoh, who might have ruled one of the greatest civilizations in human history, and who was instead swept away by a tide of collective condemnation that cared nothing for her individual innocence. But the correction is real. The names have been read, the images have been seen, the stories have been told, and the girl who was born into a revolution she did not choose. The girl who was named Beloved of the Aten, who grew up in a city built for a god, who watched her father worship the sun, and who was condemned for the worship she inherited, has been, at last, 3,300 years after the condemnation tried to erase her, restored to the record of human civilization. The 7 mechanisms of erasure documented in this series represent 7 distinct ways in which patriarchal recording systems have systematically diminished, distorted, and destroyed the evidence of women's contributions to human civilization. But the mechanisms are not merely historical curiosities. They are analytical tools, frameworks for understanding how institutional memory operates, how recording systems embed bias, and how the stories we tell about the past are shaped by the choices of the people who controlled the recording systems that produced them. The mechanisms are still at work, in subtler forms in different institutional contexts, but with the same structural dynamics that produced the erasure of Hatshepsut, the silence around Tai-Mereneset, the distortion of Cleopatra, the abstraction of Berenice, the absorption of Arsinoe, the displacement of Iset, and the condemnation of Meritaten. And yet the women are still there. In the fragments, in the inscriptions, in the ruins of cities that were supposed to have been forgotten forever. They are still there because the record, however thoroughly it was destroyed, could not be destroyed completely. The desert preserved what the censors tried to erase. The ground held what the surface was ordered to forget. and the patient work of archaeologists, digging in the sand, reading the inscriptions, piecing together the stories from the fragments that survived, has brought the women back from the silence that was imposed upon them. Meritaten was beloved of the Aten. The Aten was condemned, but the girl who bore his name survives. In the art, in the inscriptions, in the ruins of the city where she grew up. She survives because the desert remembered what the empire tried to forget. She survives because the ground is more honest than the king lists. She survives because condemnation, however thorough and however determined, cannot erase what the earth has chosen to preserve. The earth remembers. The sand holds the evidence. And the girl who was born into a revolution she did not choose is, at last, 3,300 years later, being seen.